Samuel Carter threw the plate against the kitchen wall so hard it shattered into a dozen pieces, and the sound echoed through every empty room in that big, silent house, like a gunshot fired into a grave. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at the broken porcelain on the floor, and he realized with a cold, ugly certainty that he could not remember the last time another human being had sat across from him at that table. Not one meal, not one conversation, not one living soul. Howe was 61 years old, one of the most powerful ranchers in all of Montana Territory, and he was completely, utterly, devastatingly alone. If this story is already pulling at your heart, I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very end, because I promise you, what happens between Samuel Carter and the barefoot woman who showed up at his gate is going to stay with you long after it's over. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that broken plate on the kitchen floor, and to the man who was about to make the most desperate decision of his life. Samuel Carter had not always been a man who threw things. There had been a time, many years before the summer of 1882, when this same kitchen had been the warmest room in all of Cutter's Creek. When the smell of biscuits and coffee greeted him every morning before his boots even hit the floor. When the sound of his wife Margaret's voice calling out his name felt like the only music a man ever truly needed. That time was gone. Margaret had been gone for 6 years. His son Thomas had moved to Chicago 4 years ago and sent letters at Christmas when he remembered to. His daughter Clara had married a railroad man from Denver and had her own life now, full of her own concerns, her own children, her own table set for dinner every night with people who loved her. And Samuel had this house, this enormous, echoing, suffocating house, where every room held a memory he couldn't look at directly, and every silence felt like a punishment for sins he couldn't name. He picked up the broken pieces of the plate himself, because there was no one else to do it. He swept them into the bucket by the door. He stood at the window and looked out at the ranch. Thousands of acres of good Montana land, cattle grazing in the distance, fences that ran straight and true as far as the eye could see. And he felt nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, not even the dull comfort of ownership. Just emptiness. He had built all of this for a family, and the family was gone. That was the morning Samuel Carter finally admitted something he had been refusing to say out loud for 6 years. He could not keep doing this alone. It took him 3 days to write the sign, because every time he sat down with the pen in his hand, his pride rose up in his chest like a fist and told him this was weakness. Told him that a man like Samuel Carter didn't ask for help. Told him that needing someone, anyone, was the first step toward being destroyed by losing them again. But he wrote it anyway. He kept it simple because he was a simple man at his core, no matter what the town thought of him. Cook wanted, shelter provided, inquire within. He nailed it to the post at the front gate on a Tuesday morning and told himself he expected nothing. Told himself he was being practical. Just a man who needed decent meals and didn't want to waste any more plates against kitchen walls. He absolutely did not allow himself to think the word lonely. 3 days passed. Nobody came. He wasn't surprised. His reputation preceded him the way thunder preceded a storm. Loud, unavoidable, and guaranteed to make people seek shelter rather than come closer. Samuel Carter was known throughout Cutter's Creek and the surrounding counties as a man you respected from a distance. A man who had done things in his younger years that people still whispered about. A man whose silence in a room made other men suddenly remember somewhere else they needed to be. How was fair in his business dealings? He paid honest wages. He'd never cheated a soul out of a single dollar. But warmth? Ease? The kind of comfortable friendliness that made strangers feel welcome? No. That had never been Samuel Carter. So on the 4th morning, when he came out of the barn after seeing to his horses and looked up toward the gate, he nearly convinced himself he was seeing things. There was a woman standing at his fence. She wasn't knocking, wasn't calling out. Just standing there, one hand on the post, the other holding a small cloth bag against her side, as if she wasn't entirely sure she had the right to take another step forward. Samuel walked toward her slowly, The way a man walks when he's trying to see something clearly, without letting it know he's looking. She was young. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Though the road had put years on her face that didn't belong there yet. Her dress had once been blue. He could tell by the patches that hadn't faded. But the sun and the dust had turned most of it the color of dry creek bed. Her hair was dark and pulled back, and several strands had broken free and were moving in the morning wind. She was thin in the way that meant hunger, not constitution. And her feet. Samuel stopped walking. She had no shoes. The ground between Cutter's Creek and his ranch gate was rocky, sun-baked summer earth, threaded with dry grass and scattered gravel. He had ridden that road on horseback 1,000 times and still felt it through the stirrups. She had walked it barefoot. Her feet were not just bare. They were bruised at the soles, red along the heel, and there were places where the skin had cracked and bled and dried and cracked again. Samuel Carter had been a hard man for a long time. He had made hard decisions, lived through hard losses, built hard walls around everything soft that had once lived inside him. He was not a man who was easily moved, but he stood there at his own gate, looking at those feet, and something shifted in his chest that he couldn't immediately name and didn't want to examine too closely. "You hear about the sign?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. It usually did. The woman lifted her eyes to his. They were brown, steady, and carrying something behind them that Samuel recognized immediately, because he saw the same thing every morning in his own shaving mirror. Exhaustion. The deep kind. The kind that comes not from a bad night's sleep, but from months of surviving things that were never supposed to happen to you. "I am," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "If the position is still open." "It's still open." She nodded once. "Then I'd like to speak to whoever is in charge." Samuel almost said something sharp. Something about how she was already looking at him. But the way she held herself stopped him. Straight spine, chin level. She was standing barefoot and hungry at a stranger's gate, and she was conducting herself with more dignity than half the men he'd done business with over the years. "That's me," he said instead. "Samuel Carter. This is my ranch." "Emily Dawson," she said. She didn't extend her hand because she knew he probably wouldn't take it, and the fact that she knew that she read the situation that cleanly, impressed him more than he wanted to admit. "I can cook. I've cooked for families, for ranch hands, for a hotel kitchen in Billings for 8 months before it closed. I'm not fancy, but I don't waste food, I don't make excuses, and I show up every morning whether I feel like it or not." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the bag in her hand, which was clearly everything she owned in the world. He looked at her feet. He looked back at his house, empty and silent behind him. "You got anywhere to go if I say no?" he asked. She didn't flinch. "That's not really your concern, Mr. Carter." "I'm making it my concern." She met his eyes. Something passed through hers. Not gratitude, not plea, but a kind of careful assessment, like a woman who had learned the hard way that kindness from strangers almost always came attached to something uncomfortable. "No," she said finally. "I don't." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then you'd better come in," he said, and turned toward the house. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He knew she would. And he told himself the only reason he'd said yes was because he needed someone who could cook, and this woman clearly could, and her feet needed tending to before they got infected, and that was just basic human decency. That was all this was. He told himself that all the way back to the house. He almost believed it. Emily Dawson followed Samuel Carter through the gate, across the yard, and up the steps of the ranch house without saying another word, which was exactly the right thing to do. Samuel had already made his decision, and she seemed to understand instinctively that drawing attention to it, thanking him too loudly, asking too many questions, acting surprised by his generosity, would only make him regret it. She sat at the kitchen table when he pointed to it. She didn't comment on the empty spot on the wall where something had clearly hung for years, or the single place setting, or the air of long abandonment that clung to the room like old smoke. She simply sat and waited, and when he set a basin of water on the floor near her chair, without explaining what it was for, she understood without being told, and slipped her ruined feet into it without a word of protest or thanks. Samuel busied himself at the counter with his back to her. "I'll pay you what I paid my last cook," he said. Which wasn't much, because she didn't stay long. "But you'll have your own room, your meals, and whatever you need for the kitchen." "That's fair," Emily said. "I'm not easy to work for." "I didn't expect easy. I'm up before dawn and I don't make conversation over breakfast." "Neither do I." Samuel turned around and looked at her. She was studying the room with those steady brown eyes, taking note of things. The dry goods shelf, the state of the wood stove, the water situation, with the practical focus of someone already calculating what needed to be done. "What happened to you?" he asked. He hadn't planned to ask it. It came out before he could stop it. Emily looked at him directly. "The same thing that happens to a lot of women who trust the wrong people," she said, "and then spend a long time paying for it." It wasn't an answer that invited more questions. Samuel respected that. "All right," he said, and that was the end of it. He showed her the room off the back of the house, small, clean, with a window that looked out over the east pasture. He left a change of work clothes on the bed that had belonged to Clara, which he didn't mention, because some things didn't need explaining. He told her breakfast was expected at 5:30 in the morning, and that he took his coffee black, and that she was welcome to anything in the pantry that could be used for cooking. Then he left her alone and went back out to the ranch, because that was the only thing he knew how to do well. He was halfway to the north fence when he realized he had not had a conversation that long with another human being in almost 4 months. He stopped walking, stood in the middle of his own field in the August heat, and thought about that. Then he put his hat back on and kept walking, because thinking about it too hard wasn't going to do either one of them any good. Emily Dawson's first morning in that kitchen was the first morning in 6 years that Samuel Carter sat down to a breakfast that tasted like something a person would actually choose to eat. It wasn't elaborate. Eggs, biscuits, salt pork, a cup of coffee that was strong enough to mean it. But it was hot, it was made with attention, and there was enough of it to fill a man who worked hard. He sat down. He ate. He didn't say anything. Emily sat at the far end of the table with her own plate. She had helped herself without asking, which was correct. A cook needed to eat, and drank her coffee and looked out the window at the morning light coming over the hills. Samuel had expected. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Some kind of awkwardness. Some attempt to make conversation, to fill the silence with noise the way people usually did when they were nervous. He had been prepared to be irritated by it. But Emily Dawson seemed to have no interest whatsoever in filling silence she didn't need to fill. It was possibly the most comfortable breakfast Samuel Carter had eaten in years. By the end of the first week, he noticed other things. The curtains in the main room, which had been hanging crookedly for 2 years because he had never bothered to straighten them and no one had dared to mention it, were fixed. Not replaced, fixed, with careful stitching that matched the original hem so closely you had to look hard to see where the repair had been made. The pantry, which had been a source of private shame for Samuel, because it was always half empty and disorganized, had been quietly and thoroughly reorganized. Everything sorted, labeled where it needed to be, arranged in a way that made sense. The kitchen garden, which had been his wife Margaret's great pride and had gone entirely wild and then largely dead in the 6 years since, was showing signs of life. Small signs. A cleared row. A patch of turned earth. The beginning of something. Samuel didn't comment on any of it, but he noticed. He noticed Emily the way you notice a change in the weather before you can quite put your finger on what's different. A shift in the air, a quality of light that's slightly altered. She was simply there, and the house felt slightly different because she was there, and Samuel found himself thinking about this more than he considered appropriate. He told himself it was just the food. A man thought more clearly when he was eating decently, that was all. But then there was the afternoon of the second week. He came in from the south pasture earlier than expected because one of his horses had thrown a shoe, and he found Emily in the kitchen with the window open and the afternoon light coming in long and golden across the floor, and she was singing, quietly, to herself, not performing, not doing it for an audience, just singing the way people sing when they think they're alone. A low, steady sound that Samuel could barely make out, but that landed in his chest like a fist closing around something he had almost forgotten was there. She heard him come in and stopped immediately. "Sorry," she said, and she sounded genuinely embarrassed. "I didn't know you were back." "Don't stop on my account," he said. She looked at him carefully. "You sure about that?" "I said don't stop," Samuel said, which came out sounding more like an order than an invitation. But Emily Dawson seemed to understand the difference between a man who meant stop and a man who meant please don't. Because she turned back to the pot. She was stirring and, after a moment, started singing again. Samuel sat down at the kitchen table, still in his work coat, and listened, and didn't say another word until dinner was ready. That evening, after the meal, he found her sitting on the back steps, watching the stars come out, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "You've got a good voice," he said. "My mother taught me," Emily said. She didn't look at him. "She said singing was the one thing people could never take from you, even when they took everything else." Samuel leaned against the doorframe. "Sounds like something was taken." "A good many things," she said. "Over a good many years." She paused. "You?" "My wife," he said. Simple as that. 6 years ago. Emily nodded. She didn't say she was sorry, because she could tell it wasn't the kind of thing a man like Samuel Carter wanted to hear again. She just nodded, the way you nod when you understand what a thing costs. "The garden's coming back," she said after a while. Samuel looked out at the darkness where the garden was. "She planted it," he said. "I know," Emily said. "I can tell. It was planted by someone who loved it. Those things don't die all the way." She was quiet for a moment. "They just wait." Samuel looked at her in the dark. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the sky, her face tilted up toward the stars with an expression he couldn't read and didn't try to. He went back inside without another word. But he stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that, in the dark, thinking about things he had put away in boxes and hadn't opened in years. The town started talking 3 weeks in. He heard it first from his ranch hand, a young man named Pete Grover, who was constitutionally incapable of keeping his mouth shut about anything he'd overheard in the Cutters Creek feed store on a Saturday morning. "People are saying you got a woman living in your house," Pete said, making what he clearly believed was a careful, diplomatic effort to phrase this as neutrally as possible, and failing completely. "I've got a cook living in my house," Samuel said, without looking up from what he was doing. "A young woman cook." "A woman who can cook," Samuel said, "which is what I advertised for." "People are saying," "Pete," Samuel said, and the way he said it meant stop talking, and Pete, who was young but not entirely stupid, stopped talking. But the town kept talking whether Samuel acknowledged it or not. He knew that. He'd lived in Cutters Creek long enough to know that people in small places had very little to do with their concern for other people's affairs, except apply it generously and frequently to situations that did not involve them. And he knew Emily heard it too. She was sharp, and she went to town for supplies on Thursdays, and she came back the third Thursday with her jaw set in a particular way that Samuel had learned to recognize. Not upset exactly, but hardened. Resolved. He was in the barn when she got back. He heard the wagon stop, heard her unloading the supplies, and when she came past the barn door he said, without looking up from the harness he was repairing, "They give you trouble in town?" She stopped. "Nothing I haven't handled before." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Mrs. Halford at the dry goods store asked me 3 times how long I intended to impose on your hospitality," Emily said. "As if hospitality was something I'd asked for, and you'd been too polite to refuse." Samuel set down the harness. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was employed, not housed," Emily said, "and that the distinction mattered." Another pause. She didn't seem satisfied. "She never is," Samuel said. "It's her primary characteristic." Something crossed Emily's face, almost a smile, quickly controlled. "A man named Whitmore stopped me outside the bank," she said, and her voice changed slightly when she said the name. Not much, just enough that Samuel noticed. He looked up. "Charles Whitmore?" He introduced himself. He was very polite. She said the word polite the way women sometimes said it when they meant the opposite. He asked me how long I'd known you. I told him 3 weeks. He said he'd known you much longer than that, and that I should be careful. She met Samuel's eyes. He said you weren't the kind of man a woman alone ought to put her trust in. The barn was very quiet. Samuel looked at Emily's face, and what he saw there was not fear. She wasn't afraid of Whitmore, or not primarily. What he saw was a woman informing a man of something she thought he needed to know, and waiting carefully to see what he did with the information. "Did he frighten you?" Samuel asked. "No," she said, "but he was trying to." Samuel nodded slowly. He looked back down at the harness in his hands, and he was quiet for long enough that Emily began to turn away. "Emily," he said. She stopped. "What Whitmore told you about me," Samuel said carefully, "isn't entirely wrong." He looked up. "I've done things in my past that I'm not proud of. Things that earned me the kind of reputation that doesn't fully wash off." He paused. "But I want you to hear it from me instead of from him." Emily turned back around and looked at him steadily. "I've heard it already," she said. "I asked Pete about you on my second day here, before I decided to stay." Samuel blinked. That surprised him. "And?" "And I decided that a man's past is not always the whole of who he is," she said. "Same as anyone else." She held his gaze. "I'd ask the same consideration for myself." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "Whitmore comes around again," he said. "You come get me." "I can handle Charles Whitmore," Emily said. "I know you can," Samuel said, "but I'd like you to come get me anyway." The almost smile appeared again, and this time it stayed long enough for him to see it properly. It changed her whole face, made her look for just a moment like someone who still believed in the possibility of good things happening. "All right," she said, and went to put the supplies away. Samuel sat in the barn for a while after that, not repairing anything. There were other moments. There was the afternoon. She found him at his wife's grave, which was set on the low hill behind the house under a cottonwood tree that Margaret had always loved. He hadn't planned to be found there. He went when he could no longer avoid it, which was usually late summer, because Margaret had died in August, and August always came for him eventually. Emily didn't say anything. She came and stood near him, not too close, and was quiet for a minute, and then she said, "She kept a good garden," because she had learned that already from the evidence, and because it was the truest compliment she could give. "She did," Samuel said. "The rosemary survived," Emily said. "At the south end. Everything else went wild or died, but the rosemary's still there. It's tough stuff." "She liked it because it was tough," Samuel said. He didn't know why he was telling her this. "She said if you were going to grow something that didn't need you to coddle it." "Sounds like a practical woman." "She was the most practical woman I ever met," Samuel said. "And the kindest. Most people, those two things don't live together comfortably. In Margaret, they did." Emily nodded. She looked at the headstone for a moment. Then she said, "I'll keep the rosemary going," and she turned and walked back down the hill, leaving him alone the way he'd wanted to be, but slightly less alone than he'd expected to feel. It was, he thought, a considerable skill. Knowing how to be present without taking up too much room. And there was the evening. She stood at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand, and he came in for dinner and found her staring at it with an expression that was perfectly still, in the way that only very controlled grief is perfectly still. He didn't ask. He had learned already that Emily Dawson would tell him what she wanted him to know in her own time, and asking too directly about anything she was protecting was the fastest way to make her shut down completely. He set the table around her and put the food on the stove and waited. And eventually she folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and said without preamble, "I had a brother." "Had," Samuel said, because the tense mattered. "He died last spring," she said, "in Kansas. I didn't find out until now because I haven't had an address for anyone to find me." She was quiet. "He was the last person in the world who knew me before everything went wrong." Samuel stood very still. "I'm sorry," he said. He knew it was insufficient. He also knew it was true. Emily nodded. She pressed her lips together briefly. Then she straightened and took off her apron and said, "Dinner's ready," and served the meal and sat down across from him and didn't speak again until after the dishes were done. But later that evening, when Samuel was on the back steps with his coffee and the stars were coming out, she came and sat beside him. Not close, but close enough. And they were quiet together for a long time, which was something they were becoming rather good at. It wasn't until the 5th week that Samuel admitted to himself, fully and without evasion, that Emily Dawson had done something remarkable to his house. She had made it a home again, not deliberately, not as a strategy. She hadn't rearranged the furniture, or hung new curtains, or redecorated anything in a way that announced itself. She had simply lived there. The way a person lives when they're not performing living, but actually doing it. She had moved through the rooms with increasing ease, left small signs of her presence in the kitchen and the garden, and occasionally the main room, learned the rhythms of the house, and added her own without erasing his. The silence had changed. It had been, before she came, a silence full of absence, full of the shapes of things that were no longer there. Now it was just silence. The good kind. The kind that exists between people who have no particular need to fill every moment with words. Samuel stood in the kitchen doorway one evening and watched Emily at the wood stove, her back to him, stirring something that smelled like the beef stew Margaret used to make every Sunday. And he thought, "This is the most dangerous thing that's happened to me in 6 years. Not dangerous the way Charles Whitmore was dangerous. Not dangerous the way the past was dangerous. All that old weight and old regret. Dangerous the way hope was dangerous, which was the only way that ever truly mattered. I was starting to need her. Not just her cooking, not just the warmth she brought to the rooms, not just the slight easing in his chest that came every morning when he heard her moving around in the kitchen before he came downstairs. I was starting to need her. Emily Dawson specifically, with her steady eyes and her controlled grief and her dignity that refused to bend no matter what the town said about her, with her way of seeing things clearly and saying them plainly and knowing when to speak and when to simply be present. I was starting to need her the way you need things you didn't know you were missing until you suddenly had them, and the thought of losing them became the first thing you thought about when you woke up in the morning. He was a man of 61 years who had buried a wife and raised children and survived things that would have broken other men, and he was standing in his own kitchen doorway, terrified of a woman who was making beef stew. Emily turned from the stove and found him there. She looked at him for a moment, reading something in his face with those sharp eyes of hers, and then she said, with remarkable composure, "Are you going to stand in the doorway, or are you going to set the table?" Samuel pushed off the doorframe and went to set the table. Neither of them said anything about what had passed in that moment, but something had passed in it. Both of them knew that. And somewhere out beyond the ranch gate, in the main street of Cutter's Creek, a man named Charles Whitmore was watching all of this with the patient attention of someone who intended to use what he saw. Samuel didn't know that yet, but he would. Charles Whitmore had always been the kind of man who smiled at you while he was counting your weaknesses. Samuel had known him for 23 years, which was long enough to understand exactly how the man operated. Long enough to know that when Charles Whitmore showed up somewhere unexpected, smiling that wide, easy smile with his hat tipped just so and his boots freshly polished, it was never because something good was about to happen. He showed up at the ranch on a Thursday morning, which was Emily's day to go into town for supplies. Samuel noticed that timing immediately. He filed it away without comment. Whitmore came up the drive on a fine gray horse, dressed the way he always dressed, like money that had been around long enough to stop trying to prove itself. And he dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his whole life making everything he did look effortless. He was 58 years old, with silver hair and the kind of sun-weathered good looks that some men acquired with age instead of losing to it. And he carried himself the way powerful men in the Montana Territory carried themselves when they wanted you to understand, without saying so directly, that they owned the ground they were standing on, even when the ground belonged to someone else. "Samuel," he said, extending his hand. Samuel took it, because refusing a handshake was the kind of thing that started conversations he didn't want to have yet. "Charles," he said, Didn't know you were back in the territory. Came up from Billings 2 weeks ago, Whitmore said pleasantly. Business interests. You know how it is. He looked around at the ranch with an expression of admiring appraisal that Samuel distrusted immediately. Place looks well. Better than the last time I came through. When was that? Oh, 4 years ago, maybe. After Margaret passed. He said Margaret's name with a careful, practiced sympathy that raised every hair on the back of Samuel's neck. You were having a rough patch then. I remember thinking the place looked like a man who'd lost his reason to keep it up. Things change, Samuel said. They do indeed. Whitmore's eyes drifted toward the house, then back to Samuel. I hear you've taken on some help. There it was. Samuel kept his face still. Ranch this size takes help, he said. Always has. Of course. Whitmore nodded agreeably. I just heard it was, shall we say, an unconventional arrangement. A woman traveling alone, no connections to speak of, showed up at your gate. He tilted his head slightly. People talk, Samuel. You know that. I do, Samuel said. I've never found it worth much of my time. Whitmore smiled. She must be quite capable to have earned your confidence so quickly. He paused, letting the word confidence sit in the air between them like smoke. Or perhaps something else earned it. Samuel looked at him for a long, steady moment. Long enough that a man with better instincts would have reconsidered what he'd just implied. Whitmore didn't have better instincts. He had confidence, which was a different thing entirely and frequently mistaken for the same. You've got something to say to me directly, Charles, Samuel said. You go ahead and say it. We're old enough that we can skip the performance. Whitmore's smile didn't waver. I'm saying I'm concerned, as an old friend. He put just enough weight on those last two words to make them feel like a reminder. A young woman with no history, no family, no references, arriving out of nowhere at a wealthy man's ranch. Samuel, I'd hate to see you taken advantage of. Would you? Samuel said. I would. He placed one hand on Samuel's shoulder, the familiar gesture of a man who had always assumed his touch was welcome. I know you're lonely. Anyone can see that. And loneliness makes a man susceptible. Samuel removed Whitmore's hand from his shoulder. Not roughly. Just removed it, the way you remove something that doesn't belong where it's been placed. Emily Dawson is my cook, he said. She works hard, she keeps this house in order, and she is none of your business. I'll thank you to remember that. Something moved behind Whitmore's eyes. Not anger. Not quite. More like the recalibration of a man who had expected an easier conversation and was adjusting his approach accordingly. Of course, he said, warm as ever. Forgive me. I only meant well. He turned back to his horse and gathered the reins with the practiced ease of a man who had never lost a confrontation in his life, at least not one where the other party knew they were in one. Come into town sometime, Samuel. Have a drink. It's been too long. Samuel said nothing. Whitmore rode away down the drive, and Samuel stood watching him go, and the cold, clear feeling in his chest was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was the feeling he'd had 20 years ago, sitting across a table from a man who was cheating at cards. Not the rage of it, but the absolute certainty, the knowledge of what was coming before it arrived. I went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and when Emily came back from town an hour later and saw his face, she set down the supplies without being asked and said, Whitmore came here. Samuel looked at her. How'd you know? Because of the look on your face. She pulled off her gloves. And because he was very pleasant to me in town today. Asked about my family. Offered to help me carry my parcels to the wagon. She paused. A man like that doesn't become suddenly pleasant without a reason. He was fishing, Samuel said. I know. She began putting supplies away with quick, efficient movements. For what? Samuel was quiet for a moment. He wants this land, he said. He's wanted it for 15 years. The grazing rights on the north pasture connect his property to the railroad right-of-way. If he owned my land, he'd have the most valuable cattle corridor in the territory. Emily had gone still. And before, when your wife was alive, he couldn't get it. Margaret would have laughed him out of the county, Samuel said. She was a better negotiator than I ever was, and she knew what this land was worth. He paused. After she died, I wasn't thinking clearly. Not for a long time. He made 2 offers in the first year. I turned them both down, but... He stopped. Emily turned around and looked at him steadily. But he knows you were vulnerable once, she said. And he thinks you're vulnerable again. He thinks I'm a lonely old man who's lost his judgment, Samuel said flatly. And what does he think I am? The question hung in the air. Samuel met her eyes. He thinks you're the lever, he said. He thinks if he can discredit you, make the town believe you're here for wrong reasons, he can put enough pressure on this situation that it falls apart. And then I'm alone again, and maybe this time he gets what he wants. Emily was quiet for a long moment, her hands still on the shelf in front of her. Samuel watched her face go through something. Not fear, never fear with Emily, but something more complicated. Something that looked like the particular tired anger of a woman who had spent years being made into a problem that other people were solving for their own benefit. He's not the first man to try to use me as a tool, she said finally. I know, and it's never been because of anything I did. She turned around fully and looked at him. It's because I'm convenient. People like that. They look for whatever's available to use, and I'm... She paused, choosing the word carefully. Unattached enough that nobody's going to make a fuss. I'm going to make a fuss, Samuel said. She looked at him. I'm saying, Samuel said, and he was aware of how much weight he was putting into what seemed like a simple statement. That you're not unattached. You work for me. You live on this property. Anyone who comes at you is coming at me, and I haven't let that happen with anyone in 20 years. He paused. I don't intend to start now. Emily Dawson looked at him for a long, careful moment. Reading him the way she always read him, not looking for the performance, but for what was underneath it. Looking for whether he meant what he was saying, or whether it was just the kind of thing a decent man said in a tense moment, and then failed to follow through on when the actual cost became clear. Whatever she found in his face, it seemed to satisfy her. All right, she said, and turned back to the supplies. Samuel went outside, and he was perhaps 20 feet from the door when he realized that his heart was beating harder than it had any reason to. He stopped walking, looked out at the north pasture, thought about Charles Whitmore's polished boots and easy smile, and the land that Whitmore wanted, and the woman in his kitchen who had trusted him with more truth in 6 weeks than most people managed in 6 years. I thought about the word unattached and the quiet, controlled pain in Emily's voice when she said it, as if she had long since accepted that being unattached was simply her condition, the way the color of your eyes was a condition. Something you were born into or arrived at through accumulated circumstance and simply carried with you thereafter. He walked to the barn, saddled his horse, and rode the north fence line for 3 hours, which was what he did when he needed to think without interruption. By the time he came back, dinner was on the table, and Emily was reading at the far end of the room by the lamp, and the house was warm, and Samuel Carter made himself a private and absolute promise that Charles Whitmore would not touch any of this, whatever this was. The weeks that followed were deceptively quiet, which Samuel had learned in his years of living was never a good sign. Quiet in the Montana Territory was rarely peace. It was most often something gathering itself. But there were moments inside that quiet that Samuel would carry with him for the rest of his life. There was the morning Emily taught herself to ride. He had offered, once briefly, to show her. They were too far from town for a person on foot to manage the ranch's needs independently. And Emily had accepted rides on the supply wagon without complaint, but with the contained frustration of someone who deeply disliked depending on anyone for transportation. She'd declined his offer initially. Too much else to learn, she said. Too many other things to manage first. But one Saturday morning, he came out to find her in the corral with Biscuit, his oldest and most patient mare, talking to the horse in a low, steady voice with one hand on the animal's neck and an expression of absolute focused determination on her face. Samuel leaned on the fence and watched. "You want some help?" he called. "No," she said, without looking at him. "You're going to get yourself—" "I said no," she said pleasantly, and stepped up onto the mounting block with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had decided to do something and intended to see it through, regardless of what happened in the process. She got on wrong the first time and slid off the other side and landed on her feet, which was lucky, and dusted herself off and climbed back on the block. Samuel said nothing. He watched. By the third attempt, she was in the saddle. By the sixth time around the corral, she was sitting straight and finding the rhythm of it. And by the time an hour had passed, she was walking Biscuit in clean, steady circles, with her chin up and her hands easy on the reins, and an expression on her face that was the closest thing to pure joy Samuel had seen in a long time. She brought the horse to a stop near the fence where he was standing, and looked down at him. "You could have told me," she said, slightly breathless, "that it was actually satisfying." "I could have," he agreed, "but you seemed like you needed to find that out for yourself." She looked at him for a moment, and the expression on her face was complicated, amused, and slightly suspicious, and something else that he didn't try to name. "You were watching the whole time," she said. "Making sure you didn't break anything important," Samuel said. "Which, me or the horse?" "Either one." She laughed. It was the first time Samuel had heard her laugh. A real laugh, not the polite, controlled sound she made when something was mildly amusing. And it was lower than he expected, and entirely unguarded. And it did something to his chest that he had absolutely no intention of examining. He tipped his hat at her and went back to the barn. He stood just inside the barn door for a moment, out of sight, and listened to her talking to the horse in that low, steady voice as she dismounted, and he thought, 6 years. 6 years since a sound in this place had felt like medicine for something. The gossip in town escalated in the 7th week. It came at Samuel from several directions at once, which told him it wasn't organic. Someone was feeding it, shaping it, making sure it spread to the right ears in the right way. Pete Grover reported, with the apologetic awkwardness of a young man delivering bad news to a powerful employer, that people in the feed store were saying Emily Dawson had a history of attaching herself to wealthy men, and that there had been trouble in Billings. Nothing specific enough to be a real accusation, just enough shadow to make people nervous. Samuel knew how that worked. You didn't need proof, you just needed doubt. Doubt did your work for you. He rode into town on a Wednesday, which was not his usual day, and he went directly to the feed store, and he stood in the middle of the room where Pete had overheard the conversation, and he said, loudly enough for everyone present to hear clearly, "I understand there's talk going around about a woman who works on my ranch." The feed store went quiet in the particular way that feed stores in small towns go quiet when the largest landowner in the county says something in a carrying voice. "I want to be plain with everyone," Samuel continued, because he had decided on the ride into town that subtlety had been given its chance and had not worked. "That Emily Dawson came to my ranch honestly, works there honestly, and has my full confidence. Anyone with a specific concern about that arrangement is welcome to bring it to me directly." He looked around the room. "Anyone who'd prefer to keep trading whispers in feed stores is welcome to keep doing that too. Just know I'm aware of it." He bought his supplies and left. He was back on the road home when he heard hoofbeats behind him and turned to find Reverend Aldrich, the Methodist minister who had baptized 2 of Samuel's children and buried his wife, pulling up alongside him on a modest brown horse. "That was a bold thing to do in there," the Reverend said, falling into pace beside him. "It needed doing," Samuel said. "Some people will take it as confirmation," the Reverend said carefully, "that your feelings for this woman are beyond an employer's concern. My feelings for my employees are none of the town's business. Samuel." The Reverend said his name with the particular patience of a man who had known him for 30 years and had earned the right to push a little. "Are we talking about an employee?" Samuel kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I don't know what we're talking about," he said finally, and it was possibly the most honest thing he had said out loud in years. The Reverend rode quietly for a moment. "She's a good woman," he said. "I've spoken with her twice now. She came to Sunday service both weeks you let her have the wagon." He paused. "Sat in the back. Didn't ask for anything. But she stayed afterward to help fold the pew cloths, and we talked." Another pause. "She's been through a great deal." "I know," Samuel said. "She thinks very highly of you," the Reverend said. "She didn't say so, But she spoke about the ranch with the kind of, he searched for the word, ownership that people have when they care about a place, when they've put themselves into it. Samuel said nothing. "I'm not telling you what to do," the Reverend said. "I'm 64 years old, and I've learned that's a fool's errand with stubborn men. I'm just telling you what I saw." He reined his horse to a stop at the crossroads and tipped his hat. "You've been alone a long time, Samuel. There's no virtue in it for its own sake." He turned and rode toward town. Samuel sat at the crossroads for a moment, his horse patient beneath him, and looked out at the road that led back to his ranch, and the road that led further out into the empty territory, and thought about the particular mercy and cruelty of other people, knowing you better than you knew yourself. Then he rode home. Emily was in the garden when he got back, doing what she did most late afternoons, moving through the rows of recovering plants with quiet efficiency, pulling what needed pulling, tending what needed tending. The rosemary that she had pointed out to him on the hill was now propagated into 3 separate spots along the south border. The kitchen herbs were thriving. There was a row of something that might become squash by fall. Samuel put his horse up and stood at the garden fence and watched her for a moment, and then said, "I went into town today." Emily looked up. She had soil on her hands and a streak of it across her left wrist. "I figured," she said. "You took the road horse, not the wagon. I told people in the feed store that you had my confidence and that the talk needed to stop." She went still. "You didn't need to do that." "I know." "Samuel, I know I didn't need to," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "I wanted to." Emily looked at him across the garden fence. The afternoon light was hitting the side of her face, and she had an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not exactly surprise, because Emily Dawson was not easily surprised. More like the careful, held-breath stillness of a person who had been braced for something hard for so long that the sudden absence of hard things felt unfamiliar and slightly suspect. "Why?" she asked quietly. Samuel thought about the Reverend's words. About the road home, and the road out, and the particular stupidity of going the wrong direction because the right one frightened you. "Because it was true," he said. "And because you deserve to have someone say so out loud." Emily pressed her lips together briefly. She looked back down at the garden. "Thank you," she said. It came out small, which was how he knew it was real. She did not bring it up again. But that evening she made the biscuits the way Margaret used to make them, the rolled kind with the extra layer of butter, which she had never made before, and which he had never mentioned to her. And he didn't ask how she knew, because some things you simply accept. The twist came on a Friday. It came in the form of a letter, delivered by a writer Samuel didn't recognize, addressed to Emily in a handwriting that made her face go white when she saw it. She was standing at the kitchen counter when he came inside for the midday meal, and she had the letter in her hand, and the quality of her stillness was so absolute that Samuel stopped walking. "Emily," he said. She didn't answer immediately. She was reading, or she had already read it and was reading it again, trying to find something different in it than what was there the first time, which was what people did when letters delivered news they couldn't absorb. "My employer in Billings," she said finally. Her voice was completely flat. "The hotel, before it closed." "What about it?" "It didn't close." She set the letter on the counter with precise, deliberate care, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady, and you don't want anyone to see that. "I was told it closed. That was why I was let go." She paused. "It's still open. Has been the entire time." Samuel looked at her face, then at the letter. "Someone lied to you. Someone was paid to lie to me," she said. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were doing what they sometimes did under extreme control. They were very bright and very steady, which was how he knew she was working hard at keeping herself together. "The owner of the hotel, a man named Gerard. He told me the business was failing, and he had to let the whole kitchen staff go." She paused. "The letter is from one of the other kitchen women. She tracked me down through Reverend Aldrich's church registry, apparently. She wanted me to know what actually happened." "Which was?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "Someone offered Gerard money to get rid of me specifically," she said. "She doesn't know who." But Gerard was well paid enough that he invented a reason instead of just firing me. She looked at the letter again. I had nowhere to go. I'd been in Billings 2 years. That job was I'd built something there. A life. Something small, but mine. Her voice, which had been steady to the point of being almost mechanical, did something at that word. Mine. Just the smallest crack in the surface. I left with what I could carry, and I walked for a long time. Samuel looked at her. He thought about those feet, the bruised soles, the cracked heels, the evidence of a journey no one should have been forced to make. Who would do that? He asked, though a cold, settled certainty was already moving through him. Emily looked at him. He could see she had already followed the same thought to the same place. Someone who knew I was there, she said. Someone who had a reason to make sure I kept moving, kept being rootless. She paused. Someone who didn't want me to be found. Or someone who wanted to make sure no one ever looked for me while I was finding my way, said Emily. She pressed both palms flat on the counter. She breathed slowly, once, and Samuel watched her do the thing she was so extraordinarily good at. Push the rawness of something down deep enough that she could function on top of it. He knew I was heading to Cutter's Creek. Someone must have told him. Whitmore has connections in Billings, Samuel said. He's had business interests there for 10 years. Emily turned and looked at him directly. You think he ran me out of Billings? I think it's possible, Samuel said. I think it's worth finding out. Why would he care about me? She said. He didn't know I'd end up here. He couldn't have planned. He didn't plan you, Samuel said. He was watching me. He's been watching me for years, waiting for the right moment to move on this land. When he heard I'd put up a sign for help, he may have decided to manage the possibilities. He paused. Make sure anyone who came to work for me wasn't someone who would strengthen my position. Emily stared at him. He was controlling the field, she said slowly. Running off anyone who might... She stopped. Anyone who might make me harder to move against, Samuel said. The kitchen was very quiet. He miscalculated, Emily said finally. He did, Samuel said. She looked at him with something in her face that was not quite relief and not quite resolve, but lived in the territory between them. Something that looked like a woman who had been handed an explanation for a catastrophe that had seemed senseless for months and was now, for the first time, able to direct her response at an actual target. What do we do? She asked. And it was that, the we, that Samuel felt most clearly. The straightforward, unself-conscious we, spoken as if it were simply obvious, as if it had already been true for long enough that using any other word would have felt strange. We find out what he knows, Samuel said, and we find out what we know, and then we figure out which of us has more to work with. Emily nodded. She straightened. She picked up the letter and folded it and put it in her apron pocket with the same deliberate precision with which she did everything else. I need to write back to Clara, she said, the kitchen woman. She may know more than she put in the letter. Do that, Samuel said. And Samuel. She turned back to him. Yeah. Thank you, she said, for believing me. Without... She paused, needing to think about it first. Samuel looked at her for a moment. I didn't need to think about it, he said. Some things are clear. He sat down at the table, and she poured coffee, and they sat across from each other in the warm kitchen, with the letter between them and the weight of what Whitmore had done settling over the room like weather, and neither of them spoke for a while. But underneath the anger, and the calculated thinking about what came next, and the cold clarity of finally understanding the shape of the threat they were facing, Samuel was aware of something else. Something quieter and more fundamental than all of that. He was sitting across from Emily Dawson, and she had said we, and he had felt it like a key turning. And he thought, Charles Whitmore, who prided himself on reading situations and reading people, and knowing where the pressure points were. Charles Whitmore had made one very serious mistake. He had thought that running Emily Dawson out of Billings and into exhaustion and poverty and desperation, and eventually to the gate of Samuel Carter's ranch, would weaken both of them. He had not considered that the right person, arriving at the right time, might do the opposite. He had not considered that a barefoot woman with a cloth bag and an unbroken spine might turn out to be exactly what Samuel Carter needed to remember who he was. That was Whitmore's mistake, and it would cost him. The question was when. Pete Grover came to Samuel on a Sunday morning, his day off, which meant he'd ridden out specifically and was therefore either in trouble or delivering trouble. And he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said, "Mr. Carter, I've got to tell you something. I maybe should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry for the delay." Samuel waited. "Whitmore's been talking to Sheriff Colton," Pete said. "I've got a friend who works at the jail, cleans the cells on Saturdays. She heard Whitmore in Colton's office last week. He's been telling Colton that Miss Emily might have had some involvement in the situation in Billings, the hotel." He was deeply uncomfortable, which Samuel could see, and which he respected. Pete was a young man delivering information he knew was dangerous and doing it anyway because it was right. "He's saying she might have stolen from the owner before she left." Samuel was absolutely still for 3 full seconds. "He's accusing her of theft," he said. "He's suggesting it," Pete said. Colton didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push back either, and you know Colton has owed Whitmore favors since the thing with the Parker brothers 2 years ago. He shifted his weight. "I don't know what he's planning, but he's planting seeds, and if Colton goes looking, he won't find anything," Samuel said, "because there's nothing to find." "I know that," Pete said. "But I know it doesn't always matter," Samuel said. He looked at Pete steadily. "You did right coming to me. Thank you." Pete put his hat back on, nodded once, and rode back down the drive. Samuel stood in the yard for a long moment. Then he went inside and found Emily at the kitchen table, writing her letter to the woman in Billings. She looked up and read his face the way she always read his face, in that quick, accurate way she had. "What happened?" she said. "Whitmore is telling the sheriff you may have stolen from the hotel in Billings," Samuel said. No softening. She didn't need him to soften things. Emily put down her pen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't. I know. I didn't take so much as a dinner roll that wasn't mine." Her voice was steady, but he could see the effort it cost her, the particular effort of a person who has spent years defending their character against accusations designed to be impossible to disprove. "I left that job with exactly what I'd brought to it. Less, actually, because I left some things behind when I—" She stopped, reorganized herself. "I didn't steal from anyone." "I believe you," Samuel said. She looked at him. "What does he want?" "He wants you gone," Samuel said. "And he wants me off balance. He figures if he can get Colton to question you, even just bring you in for a conversation, make it official, it'll be enough. Enough to damage your standing here. Enough to make me feel like having you here is more trouble than it's worth." "Is it?" she asked, quietly, not challengingly, genuinely asking, giving him the out, the way he'd come to understand Emily Dawson did things, always offering the honest path, even when it led somewhere painful. Samuel looked at her across the kitchen table. "No," he said, flat, certain. "It is not." Something shifted in her face, something very small and very significant that she immediately brought back under control. "Then we finish the letter," she said, picking up the pen. "And we find out what Clara knows. And we build what we need to build." She looked up at him once more. "Together." Samuel sat down across from her. "Together," he said. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees, and the garden shifted in it, and the rosemary that had survived 6 years of neglect stood straight and fragrant in the last light of a Sunday afternoon. And in the kitchen of the ranch that had been silent for so long, 2 people sat across from each other and began to plan. Whitmore had started this, but he was going to discover, and soon, that he had started it with the wrong man and the wrong woman, and he had badly underestimated what the 2 of them together were capable of. He was going to discover that the loneliness he'd counted on, the isolation he'd been cultivating in Samuel Carter for years, the slow erosion of confidence and connection and will, had ended the morning a barefoot woman walked through the gate and said, "I can make a meal from almost nothing. I was going to discover all of that. But not yet. For now, the letter. The evidence. The careful, methodical construction of the truth. For now, two people at a kitchen table, building something Whitmore could not touch. Clara's letter arrived 9 days later. Emily had been watching the road every morning since she sent her reply, not obviously. She was too controlled for obvious. But Samuel noticed. The way she found small reasons to be near the front window around the time the mail rider came through. The way she'd look up from whatever she was doing when she heard hoofbeats on the road, and then look back down just as quickly when it turned out to be nothing. He didn't comment on it. He understood what it was to wait for information that might change everything, and he understood that naming the waiting out loud only made it heavier. So he waited with her, in his own way, and kept doing the work of the ranch, and kept coming in for meals that Emily made with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, and kept sitting across from her at the table in the evenings while she read, and he looked over the ranch accounts, and kept telling himself that what they were building here, this calm, careful, functional life that had grown up between them without either of them quite deciding to build it, was sturdy enough to survive what Whitmore was preparing to do. He kept telling himself that. He mostly believed it. The letter came on a Tuesday, delivered by the regular mail rider who handed it over without ceremony and moved on down the road, and Emily took it inside with both hands, and Samuel gave her 20 minutes alone before he came in for coffee that he didn't particularly need. She was at the kitchen table. The letter was open in front of her. Her face was doing the thing it did when she'd absorbed something significant and was organizing it before she spoke. Samuel poured his coffee and sat down and waited. Clara's full name is Clara Beecham, Emily said. She worked in the hotel kitchen for 3 years. She's a careful woman, not given to gossip or exaggeration. She paused. She was there the night Gerard let me go. She heard things. What things? Emily looked at the letter. Gerard had a visitor the week before he told me the hotel was closing. A man from out of town, well-dressed, who met with Gerard in his office for 2 hours. Clara brought them coffee. She didn't hear the whole conversation, but she heard enough. She was quiet for a moment. The man offered Gerard $400 to remove a specific employee from the kitchen staff. He described her, dark-haired, early 30s, had been there about 8 months. Gerard didn't use my name in front of Clara, but it was clear who they meant because I was the only person matching that description. Samuel put his coffee down. $400, he said. That's more than Gerard made in 2 good months, Emily said. He didn't ask questions. He came to me the next day and told me the hotel was failing, and he had to let the kitchen go entirely. She folded the letter once, then unfolded it again, smoothing the crease with her thumb in a gesture that was purely mechanical, her hands needing something to do while her mind worked. Clara says the man who paid him had a Montana accent and rode a gray horse. The kitchen was completely silent. Samuel thought about the Thursday morning Whitmore had come to his ranch gate on a fine gray horse, dressed in his expensive clothes, with his easy smile and his patient eyes that had always known more than they admitted. "Did Clara see his face clearly?" Samuel asked. "Clearly enough," Emily said. "She says she'd know him again." She looked up. "She's willing to say so in writing, officially, if it comes to that." Samuel sat back in his chair. His mind was working through it the way his mind worked through problems on the ranch. Not fast, but thorough. Looking at all the angles. Calculating what you had and what you needed and what the ground between them looked like. "He planned this," Samuel said. "Not you specifically. He didn't know you'd end up here. But he was systematically clearing the field. Anyone with skills, with competence, with the kind of character that might—" He paused, choosing carefully. "Anchor someone like me. I was making sure I stayed isolated." Emily looked at him steadily. "That's a long game," she said. 15 years, you said he's been after this land." "Charles Whitmore doesn't play short games," Samuel said. "It's how he's taken everything he's ever taken. He waits, he positions, he removes the pieces that complicate his plans, and he waits for the opening." Samuel looked at her. "He's had me exactly where he wanted me for 6 years. Alone, grieving, not thinking clearly about much beyond survival." He paused. Then you came. Then I came, Emily said quietly. And everything he'd arranged started working against him, Samuel said. Because you didn't just fill the kitchen, He stopped. He was about to say something that would require him to be more honest than he was entirely prepared to be at this particular moment. And so he redirected, with the practiced evasion of a man who had been protecting his own interior for a very long time. You made this place functional again. That's a problem for him. Emily watched him redirect. He could see her watching it, the slight adjustment in her eyes that told him she'd heard what he'd almost said as clearly as what he'd actually said. But she didn't push. She never pushed. She simply filed it away in whatever careful internal registry she kept of the things he wasn't ready to say yet, and moved forward. What do we do with Clara's information? She asked. We keep it safe, Samuel said. And we get more. He's been talking to Colton. That means he's planning to make an official move. He won't go to Colton with theft accusations unless he's got something to back them up, real or manufactured. He looked at her directly. Is there anything from Billings? Anything he could twist? Anything that looked one way but could be made to look another way in front of a sheriff? Emily thought about it carefully, which Samuel respected. A less honest person would have said no immediately. There was money missing from the hotel petty cash the week before Gerard let me go, she said. I know that because Gerard mentioned it. He said it was probably a counting error, nothing to worry about. I thought nothing of it. She met Samuel's eyes. If Whitmore manufactured that, if he arranged for that money to go missing and then pointed Gerard toward me, then he's got a story, Samuel said. Circumstantial, but a story. Can a story be enough? She asked. In a place where people already doubt me? Samuel looked at her carefully. It can cause damage, he said. It can't convict you of anything. But Whitmore isn't trying to put you in a jail cell. He's trying to make you leave, make you decide this isn't worth the fight. Emily held his gaze. I'm not leaving, she said. The simplicity of it struck Samuel somewhere deep. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, the way she said most of her truest things. It was simple because it was absolute, not a declaration, just a statement of fact. The way you'd say the sun came up this morning, the way you'd say the rosemary is growing. I know, he said. I've been run off before, she said. I've left places I'd made my own because it was easier than fighting, and I didn't have anyone standing with me, and I thought... She paused. I thought that was just how it was, for someone like me. She looked at the letter in her hands. I don't think that anymore. Samuel could not entirely explain what happened in his chest at that moment. He was 61 years old, and he had thought that kind of thing was behind him. The sharp, urgent, slightly terrifying sensation of caring about someone's well-being, not as an abstract principle, but as a specific, physical concern. The sensation of another person's safety mattering to you the way your own safety mattered. The sensation of someone else's loss being something you would do serious and perhaps unreasonable things to prevent. He had not expected to feel that again. He had not wanted to feel it again. He felt it anyway. Then we stand, he said, and we fight it right. The right way turned out to be considerably more complicated than either of them expected. Because 3 days after Clara's letter arrived, Sheriff Tom Colton rode up the drive with his deputy beside him, and a look on his face that was deeply apologetic in the way that men looked when they were doing something they weren't proud of, but had decided to do anyway. Samuel was in the yard when they arrived. He'd seen the sheriff's horse coming up the road from half a mile off. You could see a long way in that country. And he'd gone into the house and told Emily calmly, Colton's coming, with his deputy. He'd watched her face go still, and then watched her deliberately relax every muscle she'd tensed, one by one, until she was standing in the kitchen with the particular composed steadiness of a woman who had decided exactly how she was going to conduct herself and was not going to be moved from it. All right, she said. You don't have to talk to him, Samuel said. You don't have to say a single word without... I know my rights, Samuel, she said. Not sharply, just cleanly. I've had occasion to learn them. He went back out to the yard and waited. Colton dismounted and had the decency to meet Samuel's eyes directly, which Samuel gave him some credit for. Tom Colton was not a bad man, I was a man in an uncomfortable position, which was a different thing, though the difference wasn't always visible from the outside. "Samuel," he said. "Tom," Samuel said. "This is a surprise." "I suspect it's not," Colton said quietly. "No," Samuel agreed. "It's not. You'd better come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Samuel, Colton, and the deputy, a young man named Harris, who held his hat in his lap and looked like he wished he was somewhere else, which Samuel thought showed good sense. Emily stood at the counter. She had not been asked to sit, and Samuel noted with quiet anger that Colton had not offered, which told him how Whitmore had framed this conversation. "Miss Dawson," Colton said, "I need to ask you some questions about your time in Billings." "You can ask," Emily said. Her voice was perfectly level. "There's been a report," Colton started, and Samuel watched Emily's face as Colton laid it out, watched her absorb the specific accusations, the missing petty cash, the dates, the amounts, and watched her do something he hadn't quite seen her do before. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, without defending herself, without the instinctive protest that innocent people often made, the rushing to explain that paradoxically made people look worse. She simply listened, and when Colton finished, she said, "May I respond?" "That's why I'm here," Colton said, with something that sounded like relief. Emily opened the drawer to her right and took out Clara's letter. This was written by a woman named Clara Beecham, who worked in the hotel kitchen in Billings for 3 years, she said. "She was present the week before I was let go. She has information about a visitor to the hotel, a man who paid the owner a significant sum of money to remove me from employment." She set the letter on the table in front of Colton. "Clara Beecham says she can identify this man. She is willing to provide a written statement to that effect." Colton looked at the letter. He looked at Emily. He looked at Samuel. "You're saying someone arranged to have you dismissed," he said. "I'm saying someone paid $400 to make sure I lost my job, my home, and my standing," Emily said. "And that the story about missing money appeared at the same time, and that I believe it was planted to make dismissing me seem justified rather than arbitrary." She kept her eyes on Colton. "I didn't take anything from that hotel. Not a dollar, not a spoon. And I believe you can verify that if you look at the actual records, rather than the account someone has given you of those records." Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Dawson, who do you believe?" "I believe," Samuel said, and his voice cut across Colton's with the flat authority of a man who had run thousands of acres for 30 years, "that you already know the answer to that question, Tom. And I believe you know who sent you out here today and why." He looked at the sheriff steadily. "I'm asking you to do your job, not the job you were asked to do by someone with an interest in this situation. Your actual job." Colton's jaw tightened. The deputy studied his hat brim with intense concentration. "I'll look into it," Colton said finally. "That's all I'm asking," Samuel said. Colton stood. He picked up Clara's letter. Emily had nodded when he glanced at it, giving him permission to take it. And he put on his hat. At the door he paused and turned back, and what he said was directed at Emily, not at Samuel. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I want you to know this wasn't my idea, coming here." "I know," Emily said simply. "That's why I'm still sitting at this table instead of asking you to leave." Something moved across Colton's face. Respect, Samuel thought. The kind that arrived unexpectedly, from an unexpected source, and didn't know quite what to do with itself. He left. The deputy left. Emily and Samuel sat in the kitchen and listened to the hoofbeats fade down the road, and then Emily put both hands flat on the table, breathed slowly once, and said, "He's going to move faster now. Whitmore. He'll know that didn't work the way he planned, and he'll accelerate." "Yes," Samuel said. "What does accelerating look like for a man like him?" Samuel thought about it. About the 23 years of knowing Charles Whitmore. About the way Whitmore moved. Patient until he wasn't. Careful until the situation demanded otherwise. And then decisive in the way that men who had rarely faced real opposition were decisive. Confidently. Perhaps overconfidently. "He'll try to get to you directly," Samuel said. "He's been working through intermediaries. Gerard, Colton, the town's gossip. When that fails, he tends to make personal contact. He paused. He'll try to make you an offer. Emily looked at him. What kind of offer? Money, Samuel said. Or a threat. With Whitmore, it's usually one or the other, and the money comes first because he prefers it. It's cleaner. He looked at her. He'll try to buy you out. Offer you enough to go somewhere new and start over, and frame it as generosity. And if I refuse? Then it gets less clean, Samuel said. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Samuel had not expected, and that landed in the room with the weight of something much larger than its words suggested. What is it he's actually afraid of? She asked. Samuel looked at her. What do you mean? Whitmore, she said. Not the land. I understand the land. The land is money and power and territory. That's straightforward. But the lengths he's going to, the $400 in billings, the months of preparation, the Colton visit, that's not just business. She looked at Samuel directly. He's afraid of something specific. What is it? Samuel sat with that for a moment. He had known Charles Whitmore for 23 years, and he had never quite framed the question that way. He's afraid of me being whole, Samuel said finally. And then stopped, because that had come out of somewhere he hadn't expected. Emily waited. When Margaret was alive, I was solid, Samuel said slowly. Rooted. I had something worth protecting, and I knew what I was protecting it for, and that made me difficult to move against. After she died, I lost that. Not all at once, gradually. The way you lose warmth in a house that hasn't got a fire. He paused. He's been waiting for me to deteriorate far enough that taking this land felt like rescuing it rather than stealing it. He's been waiting for me to become the kind of man who sells because he can't see the point of holding on. And instead, Emily said quietly. And instead, Samuel said. Neither of them finished the sentence. Neither of them needed to. The silence between them was different from the silences they'd had before. It was charged with something neither of them had named yet, but both of them could feel, the way you could feel weather coming before you could see it. Samuel looked at Emily across the table, and what he saw was a woman who had walked barefoot into his life and found every broken thing in it, and quietly, without ceremony, without asking for credit, begun to fix them. Not because she needed to, not as strategy, but because she was the kind of person who looked at broken things and couldn't leave them broken. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the 6 years of silence. He thought about the Reverend's words on the road. There's no virtue in it for its own sake. And about the plate he'd thrown against the wall. And about the way the house had felt before Emily came. And the way it felt now. And the fact that those were not the same house in any way that mattered. He opened his mouth. And then Pete Grover came running across the yard, which was the only time Pete ran. And the expression on his face was the specific expression of a young man who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see and knew he had to deliver it fast. Samuel was on his feet before Pete reached the door. What happened? He said. Pete was breathing hard. Ryder came in from town, he said. Just now. Ned Fowler, from the bank. He looked between Samuel and Emily. Whitmore made an offer on your land this morning, Mr. Carter, through the bank. Formal offer, signed and submitted. Samuel went very still. How much? He said. Pete named the figure. It was insultingly low. Samuel knew the land's value better than anyone alive. The offer was perhaps 40% of what the ranch was worth, and the deliberateness of the insult was the point. It was the kind of offer you made to a man you believed was desperate enough to take anything, or broken enough not to notice the difference. He's forcing a timeline, Emily said. She was standing now too, and her voice was absolutely steady. He doesn't want to wait for Colton's investigation to go anywhere. He's trying to make you respond now, while you're off balance. I know what he's doing, Samuel said. What are you going to do? Pete asked. Samuel looked at Emily. She looked at him. There was a question in her eyes. Not what will you do, but something more personal and more important than that. Something that had to do with whether he was the man she had decided he was. Whether the thing she had been slowly, carefully allowing herself to trust about him was actually real. I'm going to decline the offer, Samuel said, And then I'm going to go see Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale was the best lawyer in Cutter's Creek, and possibly in the territory. A small, precise man of 50 who wore spectacles and had a memory for land records and contract law that had never failed him in 30 years of practice. Samuel had used him twice over the years. He trusted him the way you trusted a tool that had never broken. He also knew that Charles Whitmore had used Nathan Hale once, 10 years ago, and that they had not parted on good terms, which Samuel filed away as potentially useful. Emily said, "I want to come." Samuel looked at her. "Hale needs to hear what I know about Billings," she said. "Clara's letter is one thing. My testimony about what actually happened is another. He needs both." She held his gaze. "Don't leave me on the side of this, Samuel. Not now." I understood what she was asking. She wasn't asking for protection. She was asking to be a participant. She was asking to stand in the thing rather than be stood in front of, which were entirely different positions, and she had enough experience with both to know exactly which one she was requesting. "You'll come," he said. She nodded once. They rode into Cutter's Creek the next morning, side by side, Emily on Biscuit and Samuel on his road horse. And they went through the main street of town at a pace that was not hurrying and not hiding, and was very clearly deliberate. People looked. Of course they looked. This was Cutter's Creek, and Samuel Carter riding through town with a woman beside him was the most interesting thing that had happened since the bank fire of 1879. Emily looked straight ahead. Samuel looked straight ahead. And if anyone had examined closely the particular quality of Samuel Carter's expression as he rode down that main street with Emily Dawson beside him, the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes and the way he sat his horse like a man who owned every inch of ground beneath him and knew it, they might have concluded that Charles Whitmore had made a significant error in believing that this man was still the isolated, eroded, half-finished version of himself that grief had made him. They might have concluded that Samuel Carter had, in some fundamental and irreversible way, come back. Nathan Hale listened to everything without interrupting, which was his great skill. He listened to Samuel's account of the land offer and Whitmore's history of interest in the ranch. He listened to Emily's account of Billings, precise, detailed, with dates and names and amounts. And he read Clara's letter twice, once quickly and once slowly. And then he set it down and looked over his spectacles at Emily with the expression of a man who was recalibrating his understanding of something. "Miss Dawson," he said, "you kept records while you were in Billings?" Emily reached into the inside pocket of her coat and produced a small, leather-bound notebook. "I keep records of everything," she said. "Wages paid, dates worked, transactions I was involved in. I've done it since I was 18 years old because—" She paused. "I learned early that a woman without documentation is a woman without a case." Hale took the notebook. He opened it. His eyes moved down the pages with increasing attention. He looked at Emily again. "You have the actual dates of the missing cash incident. 3 days before Gerard dismissed me," she said. "I was not in the hotel that evening. I was at a church supper. Reverend Morris at the First Baptist, a Wednesday fellowship. There were 40 people there. I noted it because I asked Gerard for the evening off, and he agreed. And I always noted when I had permission to be absent from the kitchen, in case it was questioned later." Nathan Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Samuel. Then he looked back at Emily. "Miss Dawson," he said slowly, "in 30 years of law, I have had perhaps 4 clients who came to me with records this thorough." He closed the notebook and placed it carefully on his desk. "This is not the documentation of a woman who was running from something. This is the documentation of a woman who fully intended to be found." Emily looked at him steadily. "I had nothing to run from," she said. "No," Hale said. "You didn't." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was what he did when he was assembling a case. Samuel had seen it before. What Whitmore has done, the Billings arrangement, the Colton visit, the land offer, each piece individually is difficult to prove as malicious. But together, he looked at them both. Together they form a pattern. And patterns, in my experience, are far more persuasive than individual events. "Can we stop him?" Samuel asked. "We can expose him," Hale said, "which amounts to the same thing in a territory where reputation is currency." He paused. "But it needs to happen publicly. And it needs to happen before he makes another move, because if he escalates, if he does something that reaches the county level, it becomes considerably more complicated. How long do we have? Emily asked. Hale picked up a pen and a piece of paper. That depends on how long it takes me to send a letter to Billings and get one back. He looked at Emily. And on whether Miss Beecham is willing to make a formal declaration. She said she was, Emily said. But I'll write to her again tonight. I'll make sure she understands what it means. Hale nodded and began writing. In the meantime, he said, I want you to do nothing that could be interpreted as aggressive or retaliatory. No confrontations with Whitmore, no public accusations, nothing that makes you the initiating party. He looked at Samuel specifically. I know that's not your natural inclination. My natural inclination is my business, Samuel said. Your natural inclination, Hale said, without looking up from his writing, would give Whitmore exactly the story he wants to tell about you. The dangerous man losing his temper over a woman. Don't give it to him. Samuel looked at his desk. He breathed. Fine, he said. Good. Hale finished writing and set down his pen. I'll begin the land record review today. If there's any irregularity in how Whitmore has been positioning his own property vis-a-vis yours, I'll find it. He looked between them. Go home, stay calm, and, Miss Dawson. He held out her notebook. Keep this somewhere safe. Emily took it and put it back in her inside pocket, over her heart. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and the light was long, and the shadows were long, and the road was quiet. And Samuel rode beside Emily without speaking for a while, turning things over in his mind. The pattern Hale had described, the deliberateness of it, the years of it. He's been at this since Margaret died, Samuel said finally. Maybe before. Before, Emily said. She didn't hedge it. He would have been watching before, waiting for an opening, and Margaret was the reason he never had one. She sounds like she was formidable, Emily said. She was, Samuel said. She was the kind of woman who could see through a man's intentions before he'd finished stating them. He paused. She would have taken one look at Whitmore and told me exactly what he was. And after she died, there was no one to do that, Emily said. There was no one to do that, Samuel agreed. He glanced at her. She was looking at the road ahead, her back straight, Biscuit moving steady beneath her with the easy rhythm that she'd given the horse through weeks of patient, consistent work. She rode well now. She rode like someone who had decided this was hers. The horse, the road, the right to move through this country like she belonged in it. There is now, Samuel said quietly. Emily turned and looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. After a moment, she turned forward again, and they rode in silence the rest of the way home, and the silence was the kind that carries more weight than words, and both of them knew it. The next blow came 2 days later, and it came from a direction Samuel hadn't anticipated, which was the direction that always hurt the worst. His son Thomas wrote from Chicago. The letter was long by Thomas's standards. Thomas was not a letter writer, never had been, and his communications tended to be brief and practical. Lists of questions about the ranch that he no longer had any stake in, but still felt entitled to have answered. This letter was different. It was 3 pages, in Thomas's tight, careful handwriting, and it took Samuel 10 minutes to read it, and by the time he finished, he had set it on the kitchen table, with the specific controlled stillness of a man who has absorbed a blow directly to the chest and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. Emily looked at him across the table. Thomas, he said. She waited. Someone wrote to him, Samuel said. In Chicago. He doesn't say who, but the information, the detail of it. It's not from gossip or rumor. Someone with direct knowledge of this situation wrote to my son and told him. He stopped, reoriented. Thomas is concerned about my judgment, about the arrangement here. He looked at the letter without picking it up. He's asking me to consider whether I'm thinking clearly. He's asking whether the woman living on the ranch has my best interests in mind. The kitchen was absolutely still. He used that word, Samuel said. Living, not working, living. He looked at Emily. He wants to come out. Emily said nothing for a moment. Then, Is that Whitmore too? Has to be, Samuel said. Thomas has no connections in this territory anymore. He left 4 years ago, and he didn't look back much. He paused. Whitmore found him and found a way to plant doubt, and Thomas, who is always worried about me without being willing to do much about it, wrote this letter. He looked at Emily directly. I need you to know that whatever Thomas believes right now, whatever he's been told— Samuel, Emily said, quietly, stopping him. He stopped. I know, she said. You don't have to. I know. I'm not sure you do, he said, because I want to say it plainly. Thomas coming here and seeing this situation and possibly deciding that you're a problem that needs solving, that would be wrong, and I won't let it stand. Emily looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was coming through the window and hitting the side of her face, and she looked tired suddenly, not the exhausted tired of hard work, but the deep tired of having spent years being someone else's problem to solve, someone else's narrative, someone else's evidence of someone else's poor judgment. He's your son, she said. Hi is, Samuel said, and I love him. But loving someone doesn't mean letting them be used as a weapon against something that matters to you. He held her gaze. You matter to me, Emily, in case I haven't been sufficiently clear about that. The air in the kitchen shifted. Emily held very still. Not the controlled stillness she deployed as armor. This was different. This was the stillness of someone standing at the edge of something and not being sure whether stepping forward was safe. Samuel. I know, he said. I know the timing is wrong. I know Whitmore is moving and Hale is working and Thomas is concerned, and this is not the moment for— He stopped. But I'm 61 years old, and I've wasted enough time on things I didn't say because the timing wasn't right. The timing's never right. There's only whether you say it or you don't. Emily looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. The careful armor was still there, but something behind it was working hard against the hinges. Don't, she said softly. Not yet. Not while all of this is— She gestured, a small gesture that encompassed Whitmore and Colton and Thomas and Clara and the entire weight of the thing they were in the middle of. Let's finish it first. Let's get through it. And then— She paused, and something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country. Then you can say what you're trying not to say, and I'll hear it properly, without all of this in the way. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. All right, she said. He picked up Thomas's letter. I'll write to my son tonight, he said. And I'll tell him the truth. He can come out if he wants, but he'll see what's actually here, not what someone's told him is here. Emily nodded. Then she stood and went to the stove, because dinner needed making, and she was a woman who understood that life continued moving even when the things inside it were standing still. And Samuel watched her move and thought about what she'd said. Let's finish it first. And felt the weight of it settle over him, not as a burden, but as something close to a promise. The thing she'd said was then, she'd said. Which meant she was already thinking about after. Which meant, in the careful, precise, thoroughly documented language of Emily Dawson, that she intended to still be here. That was enough. That was, Samuel thought, more than enough to fight for. And somewhere in Cutter's Creek, Charles Whitmore was making his final calculations, pulling his final strings, preparing to deliver what he believed would be the decisive blow against a lonely old man and an unattached woman who had no one in their corner. He had no idea. Thomas Carter arrived on a Wednesday. Samuel had written to him, a long letter, longer than any he'd written since Margaret's death, that said plainly what the situation was, who Emily was, what Whitmore had done and was doing, and what Samuel intended to do about it. He had not asked Thomas to stay away. He had not asked Thomas to come. He had simply told the truth and let his son make his own decision, which was the only thing a man could do with a grown child who had made up his mind to worry about you from a safe distance for 4 years. Thomas arrived on the afternoon stage and rode out to the ranch on a hired horse, and Samuel was at the gate when he came up the road, which meant Samuel had been watching for him, which Thomas would know, and which Samuel made no effort to conceal. Thomas Carter was 34 years old and looked like a city version of his father. Same build, Same jaw, same eyes that noticed everything and gave away very little, but softened by a decade of Chicago and office work and a life that moved indoors. He dismounted with less ease than Samuel would have liked, which was an unfair thought, and Samuel knew it. And he stood in front of his father for a moment, with his hat in his hand, and the particular discomfort of a son who has come to manage a situation and has just realized, from the look on his father's face, that the situation does not require managing. "Dad," he said. "Thomas," Samuel said. "Good trip?" "Long," Thomas said. They shook hands. Thomas looked at the ranch, at the repaired fences, the flourishing garden, the warm light coming from the kitchen window, and something moved across his face that was harder to read than Samuel expected. Not disapproval, something more complicated. "Place looks good," he said. "It is good," Samuel said. "Come inside." Emily had known Thomas was coming. Samuel had told her the same day he'd written the letter, and she had received the information with the calm steadiness of someone who had spent years being assessed by people who'd already made up their minds about her and had developed, through sheer necessity, the ability to walk into that assessment without flinching. She was at the stove when they came in. She turned when she heard the door. Thomas stopped walking. Samuel watched his son look at Emily Dawson for the first time, and he watched Thomas do what smart people did when a situation didn't match their expectations. Recalibrate quietly, absorb the discrepancy, try to reconcile what he'd been told with what was actually in front of him. What was in front of him was a woman in a practical work dress, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a wooden spoon in her hand, and the specific kind of self-possession that couldn't be performed. Either you had it or you didn't, and Emily had it the way some people had good bone structure, inherently, without effort, as a basic feature of how she was put together. "Mr. Carter," she said, and her voice was warm and entirely composed. "I've heard a great deal about you. Your father is proud of you." She paused one beat. He doesn't say so in those words, but it comes through. Thomas blinked. He had clearly been prepared for several versions of this first meeting, and none of them had involved Emily Dawson disarming him inside 4 seconds by saying something both honest and unexpectedly kind about his relationship with his father. "Miss Dawson," he said, and his voice was more uncertain than Samuel suspected he'd wanted it to be. "It's good to meet you." "Dinner's in an hour," she said, and turned back to the stove. Samuel looked at his son. Thomas looked at his father. Something passed between them that didn't need words. An acknowledgement that things were not what Thomas had been led to believe, and that they both knew it, and that the conversation about what things actually were would happen when there was more privacy. That conversation happened after dinner, on the front porch, with the stars coming out and the ranch quiet around them, and the light from the kitchen window laying a warm rectangle on the ground nearby. Emily had excused herself after the meal with the tactful precision of a woman who understood when a father and son needed space and was secure enough in her own position that creating that space cost her nothing. Thomas sat in the chair that had been Samuel's for 30 years and looked out at the dark. "She's not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" Samuel asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Someone more, I don't know. More obvious. Someone who was trying harder." He paused. "The man who wrote to me described her as a vagrant who'd taken advantage of your loneliness. Someone without character or history." "Who wrote to you?" Samuel said. He already knew. He wanted Thomas to say it. "He signed himself as a concerned neighbor," Thomas said. "Charles Whitmore." Samuel nodded slowly. "Whitmore wants this land," he said. "He has for 15 years. He's been systematically trying to remove anything that might strengthen my position or my resolve." He kept his voice even. "That includes Emily." Thomas turned and looked at his father. "He told me she appeared out of nowhere, that nobody in town knew anything about her, that you'd taken her in out of sentiment. She answered an advertisement," Samuel said. "Walked 40 miles on foot to do it. She is an excellent cook, a meticulous record keeper, and the most practically capable person I've had on this ranch since your mother." He paused. "She is also—" He stopped, considered. "She is also someone I care about. In a way, I didn't expect to care about anyone again." Thomas was very still. "Dad, I'm not asking your permission," Samuel said, and his voice was not unkind. "You're my son, and I love you, and your opinion matters to me. But I'm 61 years old, and I buried your mother, and I spent 6 years in this house alone, and I know the difference between good judgment and fear." He looked at Thomas. "This isn't fear." Thomas looked at his hands. He looked out at the dark. He looked at the kitchen window. "She put rosemary in the pot roast," he said finally. Samuel waited. "Mom used to do that," Thomas said quietly. "I haven't had pot roast with rosemary since—" He stopped. "I didn't tell her that. She couldn't have known." "She found the rosemary in the garden," Samuel said. "Your mother planted it. Emily got it growing again." Thomas was quiet for a long time. "Whitmore's really been at this for 15 years?" he said finally, and his voice had changed. The resistance had gone out of it, replaced by something colder and more focused. Thomas Carter was his father's son in the ways that mattered. "He's been positioning since before your mother died," Samuel said. "He accelerated after. He's been working at me slowly, and when he saw that Emily was here and that things were changing, he moved to cut it off." He looked at his son. "He wrote to you because he knew you worried about me. He used your concern as a tool." Thomas's jaw tightened. "He told me she had a theft accusation against her in Billings." "Manufactured," Samuel said. "We have evidence. Clara Beecham, a witness who saw a man matching Whitmore's description, pay the hotel owner to remove Emily from her job. Emily has meticulous records from her entire time in Billings that place her nowhere near the hotel on the night money was said to be missing." He paused. "Nathan Hale is building the case." Thomas turned fully toward his father. "What do you need?" he said. "Not what are you going to do? Not are you sure about this? Not have you thought it through? What do you need?" Samuel looked at his son for a moment and felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. "I need you to stay a few days," he said. "I need Whitmore to see you here, standing in this yard. I need him to understand that this family isn't as isolated as he's calculated." Thomas nodded once. The decision was made with the same economy of movement that Samuel had always made decisions, and seeing it in his son's face, the inheritance of it, was something Samuel hadn't expected to feel so strongly at this particular moment. "I'll stay," Thomas said, "as long as you need me." Samuel nodded. They sat on the porch a while longer, not speaking much, and the silence was different from the silence of the past 6 years. It was not empty. It was the silence of two people who understood each other and were in the same place about the same things, and Samuel thought, this too was something Whitmore had not calculated. That the woman who arrived barefoot at his gate would, by the force of simply being herself, begin to draw the scattered pieces of Samuel Carter's life back toward each other. Nathan Hale sent a writer out the next morning. The writer carried a letter, and the letter was brief because Hale was a man who used as few words as a thing required, and no more. And what it said was, "Clara Beecham has provided a formal written declaration, notarized in Billings. The land records show an anomaly. Come to my office tomorrow. Bring Miss Dawson." Samuel read it at the breakfast table. He handed it to Emily. She read it and handed it to Thomas, who had been watching them both over his coffee cup, with the expression of a man absorbing the evidence of a dynamic he'd been badly briefed on. Thomas read it. He set it down. He looked at Emily. "When Hale says anomaly in the land records," Thomas said, and his voice had the precise, careful quality of someone who worked in contracts and understood what that word meant in that context. "He means Whitmore's done something irregular." "He means exactly that," Emily said. Thomas looked at his father. "You need to be at that meeting." "That's what the letter says," Samuel said. "I'm coming too," Thomas said. Samuel looked at his son. "I'm a contracts attorney, Dad," Thomas said. "I've been in Chicago pushing paper for 4 years. Let me do something that matters for once." Samuel felt something complicated and good move through him. He drank his coffee. "Fine," he said. "You're coming." Nathan Hale's office was small and exactly organized. Every surface precise, every document in its exact place, which was the physical expression of how Hale's mind worked. He greeted Samuel, Emily, and Thomas with the contained energy of a man who had found something significant and was working to present it in the correct order. He seated them, poured no unnecessary pleasantries, and opened a large folder of documents on his desk. "Clara Beecham's declaration first," he said, and handed Emily the pages. Emily took them with both hands. She read slowly, and Samuel watched her face as she read, watched the controlled stillness of it, the careful neutrality she maintained, and then watched the moment she reached something in the middle of the document that broke through the neutrality, not into tears, but into an expression of raw, involuntary relief so brief that only someone watching closely would catch it. She had been believed, officially, formally, in writing, by a woman who had no reason to lie and every reason to fear Whitmore's reach. She had been believed. "Clara identifies Whitmore by physical description," Hale said. "Gray horse, Montana accent, expensive clothes." She describes the conversation she overheard, the specific amount offered, the specific instructions given. She provides the date. She provides the names of 2 other hotel staff who were present when the stranger's horse was tied outside, which corroborates her account of his visit. He paused. "It's strong, Miss Dawson. It won't convict a man in a criminal court, but we're not going to criminal court. We're going to the court of public record, and there, it's very strong indeed." Emily set the document down carefully. "And the land records?" Samuel asked. Hale turned to the larger of the 2 stacks of documents. "This required some careful research," he said, "and I want to walk you through it properly." He looked at Thomas. "Your presence is fortuitous, Mr. Carter. The relevant section is contract law." Thomas leaned forward. What Hale laid out over the next 40 minutes was this. 12 years ago, shortly after Margaret Carter's death, a surveying company had been engaged to re-examine the boundary between the Carter Ranch and the adjacent Whitmore property. Samuel had signed the authorization. He remembered it vaguely, one of many papers from that first terrible year when everything was fog and grief, and he signed what was put in front of him, because thinking carefully about anything was beyond him. The survey had produced a small but significant adjustment to the boundary line. An adjustment that moved the legal edge of Whitmore's property approximately 200 feet into what should have been Carter land. Land that included the critical northern access point that connected Whitmore's property to the railroad right-of-way. The adjustment was subtle. The paperwork was technically in order, but the surveying company that had produced it had dissolved 3 months after submitting the results, and the principal of that company had subsequently moved to Oregon, and Hale had, with the thoroughness that made him worth every dollar Samuel had ever paid him, traced that principal to a boarding house in Portland, and confirmed that the man had been paid by Whitmore personally to produce the adjusted survey. Samuel sat very still through all of this. Thomas sat very still through all of this. Emily sat beside Samuel, and her hand, at a certain point during Hale's explanation, came to rest on the table between them, open-palmed, and Samuel looked at it for a moment and then put his hand over it, and neither of them moved for the rest of the meeting. "He's already got what he wants," Samuel said when Hale finished. "He adjusted the survey 12 years ago. He already has the access point." "He has it on paper," Hale said, "but he doesn't have it in fact. You've been using that land continuously for 30 years. That use creates a legal claim that supersedes the paper boundary if challenged in court." He paused. "He knows that. It's why he wants to buy you out entirely, rather than simply using the access he's technically acquired on paper. Actual purchase is cleaner, and he's been afraid to push the boundary claim because a challenge would expose the fraudulent survey. So he's been in limbo," Thomas said slowly. "For 12 years. He has the paper, but he can't use it safely because using it draws attention to how he got it." "Exactly," Hale said. "And your father has been, forgive me, Samuel, deteriorating in a direction that Whitmore hoped would eventually produce a voluntary sale, a desperate sale, something that would make the fraudulent survey irrelevant because the land would change hands cleanly through purchase. And instead," Thomas said. He glanced at his father, then at Emily, then back at Hale. "And instead," Hale said, "your father acquired a reason to hold on, and started asking questions, and found Miss Dawson, who had documentation that pointed directly at Whitmore's pattern of behavior." He folded his hands on the desk. "Whitmore panicked. He moved too fast and too broadly, which is what men do when a long game is suddenly at risk of unraveling. He tried too many things at once. The Colton visit, the letter to your son, the formal land offer, and each move left another trace. He looked at all three of them. "I believe we have enough to bring this before the County Land Commission," he said. "And enough, simultaneously, to present to the public record in a way that makes Whitmore's pattern of behavior undeniable." He looked at Samuel. "But it needs to be done publicly and simultaneously. The land record challenge and the public exposure at the same time. If he sees the land challenge first, he'll have time to manage the narrative. If we expose the Billings story first without the land challenge, he'll reframe it as slander." He paused. "We need to do both at once, and we need witnesses." "The town meeting," Thomas said immediately. He was his father's son. He thought quickly. "There's a monthly town meeting, isn't there? The first Thursday?" 4 days from now," Samuel said. "Can you have everything documented by then?" Thomas asked Hale. Hale looked at his papers. He looked at Emily's notebook, which she had left with him after the first meeting. He looked at Clara's declaration. He looked at the land survey documentation. "Yes," he said. "Then that's when we do it," Thomas said. He looked at his father. "In front of everyone. No managed conversations, no private meetings. In front of everyone." Samuel looked at his son. He looked at Emily. Emily was looking at Hale's desk, at the organized layers of evidence they had built. She had built, over weeks of meticulous record-keeping and careful truth-telling and refusing to disappear even when disappearing would have been easier. She was looking at it the way you look at something you worked for that is finally taking a shape you recognize. "In front of everyone," she said. And there was something in her voice that had not been there before. Not triumph. Too clean for triumph. More like the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman who had spent years being made invisible by people who assumed she had nothing to fight with, discovering that she had, in fact, everything she needed. She had always had everything she needed. She had just needed somewhere to stand. The 4 days before the town meeting were the strangest 4 days Samuel could remember in a long time, which was saying something given the months that had preceded them. Thomas worked alongside Nathan Hale, parsing the contract language of the fraudulent survey with the focused attention of a man who had found his purpose in something and was not going to let it go. He came back to the ranch each evening with ink on his fingers and the particular sharp energy of someone who had spent 4 years feeling slightly displaced and had suddenly found the place they fit. He and Emily reached an understanding around the second evening, in the kitchen, when Samuel was in the barn and they were alone together for the first time. Samuel came in afterward and found them both at the table with papers between them. Emily's notebook open, Thomas pointing at something, and Emily nodding. And whatever had passed between them in his absence had clearly settled into something workable, because the careful distance of the first dinner was gone. "She's methodical," Thomas told Samuel later, in the way of a high compliment from a contracts attorney. "I know," Samuel said. "She thinks like a lawyer," Thomas said. "I suspect she had to," Samuel said. Thomas went quiet for a moment. "What Whitmore did to her in Billings," he said. "Paying to have her dismissed. Leaving her with nothing." He shook his head. "That's not just business ruthlessness. That's personal. Specific. He went after her." "He went after me," Samuel said. "She was in the way." Thomas looked at his father. "Does she know how—" He stopped. "What? How much you—" Thomas tried again, and then abandoned the sentence entirely, and said instead, "She talks about this ranch like it's hers, like she's been here 20 years instead of 2 months." "I know," Samuel said. "Is it?" Thomas asked. "Hers?" Samuel looked at the kitchen window, at the warm light behind it. "I'm working on it," he said. Thomas nodded slowly, and something in his face that had been uncertain since he arrived settled into something that looked, unexpectedly, and very much like his mother, like approval. The morning of the town meeting, Whitmore made his move. He had clearly gotten wind that something was happening. The small machinations of a small town, information moving through channels that couldn't be fully controlled. And he arrived at the ranch at 7 in the morning, before anyone was properly ready, riding hard up the drive in a way that abandoned all his usual studied ease. Samuel was in the yard. He had been expecting something. This was sooner than he'd expected, which meant Whitmore was more rattled than Samuel had known. Whitmore dismounted fast. He didn't smile. "Samuel," he said, "I need to speak with you." "I'm listening," Samuel said. "Privately." "I don't have anything private to say to you," Samuel said. "Whatever you've got to say, you can say it here." Whitmore looked at the house. Thomas was visible through the window. "Your son is here," he said, and the calculation in his voice was barely hidden now. He was gauging, measuring, trying to understand what the presence of Thomas Carter changed in his available options. "He is," Samuel said. "He'll be at the town meeting tonight." Something shifted in Whitmore's face. He looked at Samuel with an expression that was no longer pleasant, no longer patient, no longer the expression of a man who believed he had time. "I'll double the offer," he said. "On the land. Double it, right now. You walk away clean, more money than you can spend in whatever years you've got left, and none of this." He gestured vaguely. "None of this unpleasantness becomes necessary." "The unpleasantness," Samuel said, "is already necessary. Samuel." Whitmore's voice dropped, not threatening, quieter, more personal, more honest in its way than anything he'd said before. "I have been very patient, for a very long time. I have waited for this land, and I have given you every reasonable opportunity to come to a fair arrangement, and you have refused every one of them." The patience was cracking now, the polished surface of the man coming away at the edges to show what was underneath. "I am tired of waiting. I am offering you a good deal. Take it." "No," Samuel said. "You're being a fool." "Probably," Samuel said. "But it's my land and my choice and my foolishness. You don't get a say in any of it." Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. A muscle moved in his jaw. "The woman," he said. "I can make this very complicated for her. You understand that? Whatever Hale thinks he's building, I have resources he can't match, and connections in this county that go back 30 years. I can make her life here impossible." The temperature in Samuel's chest dropped approximately 15 degrees. "You can try," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I'm not threatening," Whitmore said. "I'm being realistic." "You're threatening," Samuel said. "And I want you to hear me clearly, Charles. Whatever you do next, whatever you try, with Emily, with the county commission, with anyone, I will make sure every person in this county knows exactly what you've done, what you did in Billings, what you did to the survey 12 years ago." He held Whitmore's gaze without blinking. "You've had this land in your plans for 15 years. I don't want it to take another 15 to make you understand it will never happen. So I'll say it plain. You are done here. Everything you built in this territory on other people's loss, I'm going to make sure everyone knows how it was built. And then we'll see how much your resources and your county connections matter." Whitmore stared at him. He was still staring when the front door opened and Emily walked out, and Thomas behind her, and they stood on the porch steps in the morning light and said nothing, just stood there, and the three of them together, Samuel in the yard, Emily and Thomas on the steps, formed something that even a man of Whitmore's particular blindness could read clearly. Not isolation, not a lonely old man with no one in his corner. A family. Something passed across Whitmore's face that Samuel had never seen there before in 23 years of knowing him. Fear. Real fear, the kind that came when a man realized he had been operating on a false map, that the territory he thought he understood had changed around him while he was busy being confident, and that the position he had believed was strong was in fact exposed. He mounted his horse without another word. He rode down the drive without looking back. Samuel watched him go, and then turned to look at Emily and Thomas on the steps. And Emily met his eyes over the yard with an expression that was perfectly level and perfectly resolved. And the morning light was hitting the ranch the way it did in late August when the summer was bending toward its end, and the air had that particular quality of something that was almost over and something else that was about to begin. "Well," Thomas said from the porch. "Well," Samuel agreed. "Tonight then," Thomas said. "Tonight," Samuel said. The town meeting of Cutter's Creek was held in the same hall it had been held in for 20 years, a large room above the feed store that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, and the accumulated weight of every disagreement this community had ever tried to talk through. Samuel had sat in that room for 3 decades, through water rights disputes and fence line arguments, and the yearly battle over road maintenance contributions. And he knew its rhythms, knew which seats the powerful men chose, and which corners the uncertain people drifted toward. He arrived early, with Emily on his left and Thomas on his right, and Nathan Hale behind them with a leather satchel that held everything they'd built over the past weeks. The room filled up faster than usual. Word had gotten around that something was happening, the way word always got around in small places, and by the time Mayor Aldous Briggs called the meeting to order, the room was fuller than Samuel had seen it in years. Whitmore was there. Of course he was. He sat near the front with 2 of his ranch managers and the particular surface composure of a man who had decided that confidence was his best remaining armor. Sheriff Colton was there, in his official capacity, seated to the side. Reverend Aldrich was there, in the 3rd row, and there were women. Samuel recognized from the dry goods store and the church and the Wednesday market the women who had whispered about Emily for weeks, who had judged her without knowing her, who had decided what she was based on what she had rather than who she was. Those women looked at Emily now as she came in and found her seat, and whatever they saw in the way Emily Dawson walked into a room and sat down, the straight spine, the level chin, the absolute absence of apology in any part of her bearing, made several of them look away first. Nathan Hale spoke for 34 minutes. Howe was a precise man, and 34 minutes was enough time to lay out, document by document, witness by witness, the complete architecture of what Charles Whitmore had built over 15 years in this county at the expense of other people. The fraudulent survey, the Billings payment, the manufactured theft accusation, the pressure on Sheriff Colton, the letter to Thomas Carter in Chicago. Each piece alone was suggestive. Together they were devastating. He presented Clara Beecham's declaration. He presented Emily's notebook, page by page, dates and wages and transactions that placed her whereabouts with the accuracy of a legal brief. He presented the original survey records and the adjusted records side by side, and explained, in language even a feed store full of ranchers could follow, exactly what had been changed and why it mattered. The room was very quiet throughout. Samuel watched Whitmore's face, watched the composure erode slowly, the way a riverbank erodes, not all at once, but piece by piece, each wave of documentation taking another section with it. At the end, Hale said, "I have filed a formal challenge to the boundary survey with the County Land Commission, effective this morning. I have also submitted Miss Dawson's documentation and Mrs. Beecham's declaration to the county clerk as a matter of public record." He looked around the room. The people of Cutter's Creek have a right to understand how business has been conducted in their county on their behalf. Then he sat down. The room remained quiet for a moment, and then Reverend Aldrich, who had sat through it all in the 3rd row, with his hands folded and his face still, stood up and said, in his carrying, Sunday service voice, "I believe an apology is owed." He was not looking at Whitmore. I was looking at Emily. This community, he said, made assumptions about a woman who had done nothing to deserve them. We judged her without evidence and repeated rumors without care, and made her feel unwelcome in a place where she had worked honestly and conducted herself with more integrity than we showed her. He paused. I am speaking for myself first, and I would invite others who share in that to consider whether they might do the same. The silence that followed was the specific, uncomfortable silence of people being offered the chance to be better than they have been, and trying to decide whether to take it. Mrs. Halford, from the dry goods store, the same Mrs. Halford who had asked Emily 3 times how long she intended to impose on Samuel's hospitality, stood up slowly. She did not look comfortable. She looked like a woman doing something hard because it was right, which was, Samuel thought, the only time doing something right meant anything. "Miss Dawson," she said, "I owe you an apology. I was unkind, and I was wrong." Emily looked at her. Her face was very still. "Thank you, Mrs. Halford," she said quietly. 2 other women said similar things. Not all of them. Some of them were looking at their hands or the floor or the window with the determined blankness of people who had decided they didn't need to say anything out loud. That was their choice. Samuel didn't push it. Public reckonings were not clean or complete, and expecting them to be was its own kind of naivety. What mattered was that it was happening at all. Whitmore left before the meeting formally concluded. He stood up in the middle of Aldrich's remarks and walked out with his managers behind him, and the sound of his boots on the wooden floor was very loud in the quiet room, and everyone watched him go, and no one said anything, and that silence, that particular collective, knowing silence, was its own kind of verdict. Outside afterward, in the cooling evening air, Thomas stood next to Samuel and said, "That went about as well as it could." "Better than some things," Samuel agreed. "Whitmore's not finished," Thomas said. "Men like that don't accept defeat cleanly." "No," Samuel said, "but he's exposed, and exposed men have to be a lot more careful." He looked at his son. "Hale will handle the land commission. It'll take time, but it'll hold." Thomas nodded. He looked at Emily, who was speaking with Reverend Aldrich and the Reverend's wife nearby, her head tilted slightly, listening to something the older woman was saying with the full, genuine attention she gave to everything. "She's going to be all right," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "She was always going to be all right," Samuel said. "She was managing that long before I came into it." Thomas smiled, which was rare enough that Samuel noticed it. "Yeah," he said, "but it's better with someone standing beside you." Samuel looked at his son. He thought about the years in that empty house. He thought about the plate against the wall. He thought about bare feet on rocky ground, and a woman who said, "I can make a meal from almost nothing," and meant it about considerably more than food. "It is," he said. "It is considerably better." The three of them walked back to the wagon together, and the stars were out in full over Cutter's Creek, and the air smelled like late summer and dry grass, and the particular cleanness that comes after something that has been festering for a long time is finally brought into the light. Emily climbed up to the wagon seat and gathered the reins, because she drove now. She had insisted on learning, and Samuel had let her, because letting Emily Dawson learn to do things she'd decided to learn was less a decision than a fact of nature. And Samuel climbed up beside her, and Thomas sat in the back, and they rode home through the dark. Halfway back, Thomas fell asleep in the wagon bed, which was either the exhaustion of 4 days of legal work or a very tactful decision to give his father and Emily some privacy, and Samuel suspected it was both. Emily drove without speaking for a while. Then she said, "Mrs. Halford apologized." "She did," Samuel said. "I didn't expect that," Emily said. "People are sometimes better than you expect," Samuel said. "Not always, but sometimes." Emily was quiet for another moment. "The Reverend's wife invited me to the church ladies' Thursday lunch," she said. There was something in her voice that she was working to keep neutral and wasn't entirely managing. "She said they made a new pot every week and there was always room for one more." Samuel looked at her profile, at the careful neutrality she was working on. "Will you go?" he asked. Emily kept her eyes on the road. "Yes," she said. "I think I will." A pause. "I haven't been invited to things in a long time." She said it simply, without drama, as a fact, the way she said most of her truest things. "It's a small thing." "It's not a small thing," Samuel said. She glanced at him, and the expression on her face in the dark, lit only by starlight and the distant lamp of the ranch coming into view ahead of them. It was not the controlled, careful, composed expression she wore when she was managing herself. It was something underneath that. Something that had been kept very safe for a very long time, and was just now, slowly, beginning to consider whether it was safe enough to come out. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." The ranch came into view ahead of them, lit and warm. Home. Thomas stayed for 10 days. He had said a few days, and then a few more. And by the end of it, nobody was counting because he had stopped feeling like a visitor and started feeling like what he actually was, which was a man who had come home and was taking a while to remember what that meant. He worked alongside Pete Grover on the fences in the mornings. He sat with Samuel over the ranch accounts in the evenings and asked questions that were sharp and useful and showed that he had been paying more attention to this land from Chicago than he had let on. He ate Emily's cooking with an appreciation that was so genuine it occasionally made her smile the way she smiled when she wasn't thinking about it, quickly, fully, without the careful management she usually applied. On the 8th morning, he found her in the kitchen before Samuel was up, which was rare because Emily was always up before anyone, and had generally already made peace with the day before the rest of the household caught up with it. She was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, and she didn't startle when Thomas came in, just made room on the window side without being asked. They stood there for a moment, both looking out at the early light on the east pasture. "He hasn't slept this well in years," Thomas said. "Pete told me. Said the whole ranch noticed a change months ago, before any of the Whitmore business." Emily said nothing. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," Thomas said. "You're not," she said. "I was wrong about you," he said. "Before I came. I want to say that plainly." Emily turned and looked at him. "You were working with bad information," she said. "That's different from being wrong." "It's not different enough," Thomas said. "I should have come out years ago. I should have been here." He looked out the window. "I left because it was too hard. After Mom. The house, the land, all of it. It was too much of her, and I couldn't." He stopped. "I told myself Dad was fine. He's Samuel Carter. He doesn't need anyone. I told myself that right up until a man with an agenda wrote me a letter, and I believed it over my own father." Emily was quiet for a moment. "You're here now," she said. "Because of you," Thomas said. "Indirectly. Because you came here and things changed enough that Whitmore felt he had to move, and when he moved, he made enough noise that even someone paying as little attention as I was couldn't ignore it." He looked at her. "I owe you for that." "You don't owe me anything," Emily said. "You owe your father some regular correspondence and an occasional visit. That's between you two." Thomas almost smiled. "He said you were direct." "He said that?" Emily looked surprised. "He said—" Thomas paused, choosing the words. "He said you were the most plainly honest person he'd met since my mother. He said it like it was the highest thing he could think of." Emily looked back out the window. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to control, which was notable because Emily Dawson controlled most things that moved across her face most of the time. "She set a high standard," Emily said quietly. "She did," Thomas said. "But I think—" He stopped, and then finished it because he was his father's son, and finishing things plainly was in the blood. "I think she'd be glad. For what's here. For what you've made here." Emily held her coffee cup in both hands and didn't answer, but the quality of her silence was different from her usual silences. It was not the silence of a woman managing herself. It was the silence of a woman receiving something she hadn't been sure she was allowed to want and not quite knowing where to put it. Thomas poured his own coffee and left her to it. He rode back to the stage for Chicago 2 days later, and the goodbye between him and Samuel was brief and physical. A handshake that turned into something closer. And then he turned to Emily and said, "You'll write." "If you write first," she said. He grinned, which was rare enough that Samuel stared at it for a moment. "Fair," Thomas said. He mounted up. "Take care of him." "He takes care of himself," Emily said. "I just make sure he eats properly." Thomas laughed and rode down the drive and turned once at the gate to look back, and then he was gone down the road, and Samuel and Emily stood side by side and watched him go. After a while, Samuel said, "Thank you." Emily looked at him. "For what?" "For whatever you said to him that first morning," Samuel said, "before I was up." Emily looked at the empty road. "I didn't say much," she said. "He mostly talked." "Whatever it was," Samuel said. She glanced at him sideways. "You're welcome," she said, and went inside. September came in slowly, the way Montana Septembers did. The mornings getting sharper, the light shifting angle, the hills going from summer gold to something deeper and more complicated. The garden that Emily had spent months coaxing back to life was producing with a generosity that seemed almost deliberate, as if the earth had been waiting for someone to pay it the right kind of attention and was now making up for lost time. There were squash and late tomatoes and the kitchen herbs in abundance, and the rosemary that had survived 6 years of neglect stood thick and fragrant at the south end, exactly as Margaret had planted it, tougher than anything around it. The County Land Commission had received Hale's filing and opened a formal review. This would take months. The law moved the way it moved, at its own pace, indifferent to the urgencies of the people waiting on it. But Hale had been clear that the evidence was solid and the outcome likely, and Samuel had lived long enough to know that likely was as good as certain in most of the situations that mattered. Whitmore had gone quiet, not gone. A man like that didn't disappear simply because he'd been exposed. He was still in the territory, still had his property, still had resources and connections, and the capacity for patience that had made him dangerous for 20 years. But the public record filing had changed the calculation for him in a fundamental way. He could not move against the Carter Ranch now without drawing the exact kind of attention he most needed to avoid. He was contained, which was not the same as defeated, but was close enough for the immediate future. Colton had come out to the ranch one afternoon, without Whitmore's instigation this time, and had stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said to Samuel, "I should have pushed back harder. When he came to me, I knew what he was doing and I went along with it because it was easier." "You know now," Samuel said. "He wasn't in the business of extracting more than that." "I'll do better," Colton said. He glanced toward the house, where Emily was visible through the window. "She's a good woman. I hope she knows people see that now." "She knows," Samuel said. Colton nodded and rode back to town. The Thursday lunch at the church had happened twice now. Emily came back from the first one with the particular self-contained quietness she wore after something had affected her that she was still absorbing, and Samuel hadn't asked directly. But later that evening she had said, almost to herself, "The Reverend's wife told me she's been making the same pot of soup every Thursday for 19 years, and she's never once found a person who showed up and wasn't glad they did." She paused. "I was glad I did." "Good," Samuel said. "Mrs. Halford was there," Emily said. "She sat next to me." "Was that all right?" "It was awkward," Emily said honestly, "for both of us. And then it was a little less awkward. And by the time the soup was done it was—" She paused. "Tolerable. Maybe slightly better than tolerable." "That's how most things start," Samuel said. She looked at him. "Is that wisdom or exhaustion?" "With me, it's usually both," he said. She smiled at the table, a small private smile, and poured more coffee. He watched her do it, and thought about what Thomas had said. He said it like it was the highest thing he could think of, and thought about the months between August and September, between a plate against a wall and a kitchen that smelled like rosemary and coffee, and the slow, patient return of everything worth having. He had been building to something for weeks. He knew it. Emily knew it, because Emily knew most things about what was happening between them before he did, and had been waiting with the particular quality of patience that she brought to everything. Not passive, not resigned, but grounded, present, certain, in some deep internal way, of what was coming and willing to give it the time it needed to arrive in its own form. He had promised her he would say it when the fighting was done. The fighting was done, or done enough. Done in the way that things were done when they were settled into their proper resolution, and would continue working themselves out without requiring his constant direct attention. He had run out of reasons to wait. It was an evening in the last week of September, the light going golden and long across the floor of the kitchen, and Emily was sitting at the table with her notebook open. She was still documenting, still keeping the records she had kept her whole adult life, out of the learned necessity of a woman who needed to be able to prove what was hers. And Samuel had been standing in the doorway for long enough that she'd noticed him there and waited, and then looked up. "You're doing the doorway thing," she said. "The what?" "You stand in doorways when you're deciding whether to say something," she said. "You've done it since the first week I was here." Samuel looked at the doorframe. "I do that?" "Consistently," she said. He stepped into the kitchen and sat down across from her. She closed the notebook and set the pen beside it, and looked at him with the steady, clear attention that he had come to understand was her version of openness. She couldn't always do open arms, wide gesture openness. Life had trained some of that out of her, but this direct, undivided, honest attention, was the same thing in her language. You said to let the fighting be done first, he said. I did, she said. It's done, he said. It is, she said. He looked at the table between them. He was not, had never been, a man who spoke easily about interior things. Margaret had always said his feelings arrived in actions. He showed you instead of told you, and you either learned to read that, or you spent your whole marriage waiting for words that weren't going to come in the form you expected. Margaret had learned. It had taken some time, but she had learned, and she had loved him in the specific way you loved a person whose language was different from yours, and you'd taken the time to become fluent. I thought Emily Dawson might already be fluent, but he was going to try the words anyway. I have lived in this house for 30 years, he said. 24 of those years with Margaret. 6 of them alone. In those 6 years I forgot what this place was supposed to feel like. He looked up at her. You came here and reminded me. Not by trying to replace what was gone. Not by filling in the spaces with something that didn't fit. But by being here. Exactly who you are, exactly the way you are, and letting that be enough. Emily was very still. You are the most honest person I know, he said. The most capable. The most... He paused, and chose carefully. The most whole, considering everything that's been done to try to break you. You walked barefoot into my life, and you did not ask me to save you, and you did not try to save me, and somehow... He stopped, started again. Somehow we saved each other anyway, without planning to, without deciding to. He looked at her directly. I love you, Emily, he said, plainly. Without decoration, because he was a plain-speaking man, and she was a woman who valued plainness. I don't know what shape that takes going forward. I don't know what you want, or what you're willing to consider, or what your life has left room for in that direction. But I promised I'd say it when the time was right, and I am 61 years old, and there is no more right time than this one, so I'm saying it. The kitchen was very quiet. Emily looked at him for a long time. Long enough that a less certain man might have found something to be anxious about in the length of it. Samuel was not anxious. He had said the true thing, and now the truth was in the room between them, and it would be what it was. He had not spent 6 years alone, and then another several months learning to understand this woman, only to become afraid of her answer. When she spoke, her voice was low and careful, and entirely her own. I have spent most of my adult life, she said, being useful to people who did not consider me worth keeping. She kept her eyes on his. I was let go when I was no longer convenient. I was dismissed when I became complicated. I was run off when someone found it profitable to run me off. She paused. I am not. I do not come without history. I do not come without the weight of all those places I was put out of. Another pause, longer. I came to your gate with nothing, and I told you I could make a meal from almost nothing, and that was true. It is still true. But I have been making meals from almost nothing for so long that I had forgotten what it was to be given. She stopped. Her voice had done the thing it sometimes did. Not quite broken, but strained. The way a rope strains when it's carrying something very heavy and is holding, still holding, but only just. What it was to be given more than almost nothing. Samuel did not move, did not reach across the table. He waited, the way he'd learned to wait with her, the patient, steady, present kind of waiting that was itself a form of saying, I am here and I am not going anywhere. You gave me a room, she said. And then you gave me a kitchen. And then you gave me a horse and a garden, and you stood up in a feed store and told people I had your confidence. She looked at the table briefly, then back at him. And you didn't do any of it because I earned it, or at least not only that. You did it because... She paused. Because that is who you are. When you decide someone matters, you don't qualify it. You don't ration it. That's true, Samuel said quietly. I know it's true, she said. I have been paying attention. She looked at him, and the careful armor that was always present in her face was down. Fully down, in a way he had only glimpsed before in unguarded moments. Her singing at the stove, her laughing in the corral, her face on that September evening when Thomas told her what Samuel had said about her. Fully down, And what was underneath it was not the fragility he might have expected from a woman who had been through what she had been through. What was underneath it was something strong and clear and almost fiercely itself. "I love you too, Samuel Carter," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting until I was sure you wouldn't." She stopped. "Wouldn't what?" he said. "Wouldn't need me to be something I'm not," she said. "Some people love you, and then they need you to be different than you are, and that is its own kind of being let go of." She held his gaze. "I needed to know you loved what was actually here." "I do," he said. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while. I just needed to hear it." Samuel looked at her across the table. The woman who had walked into his life barefoot and hungry and unbowed, who had stood in his kitchen and faced his son, and faced the town, and faced Whitmore, and faced every single thing that came at her, without once asking him to fight her fights for her, only to stand beside her while she fought them herself. And he thought that this was what Margaret had always said about the things worth having. They did not come looking for you. You did not stumble on them. You worked toward them, and sometimes the work was long, and sometimes it was harder than you thought you could stand. And sometimes it looked, from the outside, like something that could not possibly end well. And then it did. It did, in fact, end well. He reached across the table and took her hand, the right one, which was resting beside the closed notebook, and she turned it palm up and held his. And they sat in the late September kitchen, in the long golden light, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed to be said. Later that evening, they sat on the back steps. The same back steps where they had sat in August, weeks ago, in the early days when they were still learning the shape of each other's silences. And the stars were coming out over the Montana territory. One by one, the way they always did, slowly and then all at once. And the garden was fragrant in the cooling air. And somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote called once and was quiet. "What do you want?" Samuel asked. He was not asking philosophically. He was asking practically, the way he asked practical things, because wanting something and having it were two different things, and he was a man who built toward concrete outcomes. Emily thought about it. She gave it the real consideration she gave to everything. "I want to stay," she said. "This place, this land, what we've built here." She paused. "I want what's in that garden to be mine to tend. I want to ride Biscuit without asking permission. I want to write to Thomas and have him write back and come out next summer and complain about the heat." She paused again. "I want the Thursday lunches to become ordinary. I want to stop waiting for someone to tell me I've imposed long enough." Samuel listened to all of it. "Then those things are yours," he said simply. She looked at him. "Just like that?" "Just like that," he said. "That's not how things usually work," she said. "I know how things usually work," Samuel said. "This is how this works." Emily looked at him for a moment with an expression that was still absorbing the straightforwardness of him, the way she had been absorbing it since the first day. The way Samuel Carter simply decided a thing, and the thing was decided. No hedging, no qualification, no elaborate system of conditions and contingencies. He said what was true, and he meant what he said, and he did not, as she had told him she needed, require her to be different than she was. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he felt the weight of it. Slight, specific, deliberate. And they sat like that while the stars finished coming out, and the night settled fully over the ranch. "The rosemary needs cutting back before the first frost," she said. "I know," he said. "We should do it this week." "We will," he said. Months passed after that, in the way that good months passed. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the full feeling of time that was being used well. Hale's Land Commission challenge worked its way through the county process with the dignified slowness of legal machinery that was pointed in the right direction and would eventually arrive where it was going. Whitmore did not make another move on the ranch. He was not, as Thomas had predicted, finished, but he was careful now in a way that he had never needed to be before, and careful men were far less dangerous than confident ones. Clara Beecham wrote again in October, a longer letter this time, telling Emily that Gerard had quietly admitted to two of the remaining hotel staff that he'd been paid to dismiss her, and that the knowledge of it had spread through the Billings kitchen community in the way that knowledge spread among working people, fast and thorough, and with a righteous anger that those communities saved for abuses that struck close to home. Clara said that Emily had become something of a story there. The woman who hadn't run, who had turned around and documented everything and fought back and won. Clara said she told the story to anyone who would listen. Emily read this letter at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time afterward. "What is it?" Samuel asked. "She says I became a story," Emily said. She looked up. "I spent years being no one's story, being the kind of person things happened to who didn't matter enough to be talked about." She folded the letter carefully. "It's strange, to matter somewhere you're not." "You matter plenty of places you are," Samuel said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's what's strange. I'm not used to it." "Get used to it," he said. She smiled. "Working on it," she said. Thomas came back at Christmas. He brought a woman from Chicago named Ruth, who was quiet and observant in a way that Emily immediately respected, and who spent the first day watching how everyone moved through the ranch before she said much at all. By the second day she was in the kitchen with Emily asking about the rosemary bread, and by the third day she and Emily had developed the easy shorthand of women who recognized in each other a certain orientation toward life. Practical, clear-eyed, not interested in pretense. Thomas watched this from the main room with Samuel and said, "Is it always this easy out here?" "Nothing here has been easy," Samuel said. "You know what I mean," Thomas said. Samuel looked at the kitchen doorway, from which the sound of conversation and the smell of bread were coming in equal measure. "No," he said, "it's not always easy. But the right things, the things that are supposed to work, those tend to work." He paused. Eventually, Thomas agreed. New Year came in cold and clear, the way Montana New Year's did, with a sky so sharp and starlit it looked artificial, and Samuel and Emily stood at the back door looking out at it, while the warmth of the house lay against their backs and the cold of the open country lay against their faces. And the combination of those two things was, in its own way, exactly what this life had always been. He had married her in November, in the small church in Cutter's Creek, with Thomas and Ruth as witnesses and Reverend Aldrich officiating, and a good portion of the town present because Cutter's Creek was a small place, and a wedding was a thing people showed up for. And some of those people had things to make up for, and showing up was one way to begin. Mrs. Halford had brought a pie. It was a very good pie, and Emily had thanked her with the particular directness she brought to everything. And Mrs. Halford had looked like a woman who had been let off a hook she hadn't been sure she deserved to be let off, and was grateful in a way she didn't quite have words for. The ceremony was short, because Samuel had asked for short. He was a man who said what he meant and saw no reason to take longer than necessary to do it. And when Reverend Aldrich asked him to say what he wished to say to his bride, Samuel looked at Emily and said, "I put a sign on my gate because I was lonely and I thought I needed a cook. You came and you cooked, and you were more than I knew to ask for. You are more than I deserve, probably. But I intend to spend whatever time I have left being worth it." Emily had looked at him through the whole of it with those steady brown eyes, and when it was her turn, she said, "I walked 40 miles on foot to reach a sign that said shelter provided. I found more shelter here than I knew existed." She paused. "I will spend every day being grateful for it and proving it was not misplaced." That was all. That was enough. They had driven home from the church in the wagon, side by side, and the road was familiar, and the horse knew the way, and the ranch was lit and waiting when they arrived, and Emily jumped down before Samuel could help her, and stood looking at the house for a moment in the November cold, with her wedding dress under her work coat, because she was, fundamentally, a practical woman who had worn the dress for the ceremony and had every intention of being useful for the rest of the day. "Home," she said. Not a question, not a sigh, just the word, spoken with a completeness that contained everything. The 40 miles of road, the gate, the sign, the kitchen, the garden, the rosemary, the town meeting, the letter from Billings, the Thursday lunches, Thomas, the conversations on the back steps under the stars, the hand across the table, all of it. the whole of what had been built between two people who had needed to be found and had found each other instead. "Home," Samuel said, and they went inside. The ranch that had been silent for 6 years was silent no longer. It was full, not loudly, not in this way of performance or effort, but in the way of a place where people actually lived, where meals were made with attention and eaten with conversation, where horses were ridden by a woman who had learned because she decided to, where a garden grew because someone had decided the growing of it was worth the work, where a son wrote letters and visited in the summer and brought his wife, who made friends with the woman who had become his stepmother and corresponded with her through the year, where a man who had spent 6 years surviving remembered, slowly and then all at once, what it meant to live, where a woman who had spent years being told she had nowhere she belonged discovered that the place you belong is not given to you by the people around you. It is built by your own 2 hands, from the ground up, one honest day at a time. And when you have built it, it is yours in a way that nothing and no one can take from you. Because a home is not walls and a roof and land with your name on the deed. A home is the place where someone knows you fully and chooses you anyway. Where your history does not disqualify you, and your scars do not define you, and the worst that has been done to you is not the last word on what you are worth. Emily Carter had been worth this all along. She simply needed a gate to walk through, and a man stubborn enough to leave it open.